The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle represents one of the most comprehensive and sophisticated historical records produced in early medieval Europe, combining analytic entries with detailed narrative accounts that provide unprecedented insight into Saxon political development. The Chronicle's use of vernacular language rather than Latin made historical knowledge accessible to broader audiences, while establishing precedents for national historical writing that influenced later medieval historiography. Saxon contributions to European monasticism included architectural innovations, manuscript production techniques, and educational methods that influenced continental European religious development, while preserving classical learning during periods of political instability. The scripturums established at Saxon monasteries like Wearmouth, Jarrow, Winchester, and Canterbury produced illuminated manuscripts that rivaled contemporary continental European achievements, while developing distinctive artistic styles that combined Germanic decorative traditions with Christian iconography. The educational programs developed at Saxon monasteries created scholarly traditions that attracted students from throughout Europe, while preserving and transmitting classical texts that might otherwise have been lost. The archaeological discoveries of the past century have fundamentally transformed scholarly understanding of Saxon civilization, revealing the sophistication of Saxon material culture, the extent of their trade networks, and the complexity of their social organization. The Sutton Hoo ship burial complex provided unprecedented insight into the wealth and international connections of early Saxon kingdoms, with grave goods that demonstrate trade relationships extending from Scandinavia to the eastern Mediterranean. The discovery revealed the sophisticated craftsmanship of Saxon metalworkers, the extent of their diplomatic relationships, and the resources available to successful Saxon rulers. Recent archaeological investigations at Saxon settlement sites have revealed urban planning, craft specialization, and commercial activities that demonstrate the economic sophistication of Saxon civilization, while correcting earlier scholarly assumptions about the primitive nature of post-Roman British society. Excavations at sites like Hamwick, Lund-Denvik, and Euphoric have uncovered evidence for systematic urban development, specialized craft production, and extensive trade networks that connected Saxon England to commercial systems throughout northwestern Europe. The material evidence reveals population levels, economic activities, and living standards that challenge traditional narratives about the decline of civilization following the Roman withdrawal. The reassessment of Saxon contributions to European medieval civilization has revealed their crucial role in preserving and transmitting classical learning, developing innovative governmental institutions, and creating cultural achievements that influenced European development for centuries. Saxon scholars like Bede, Alcuin, and Alfrey made fundamental contributions to European intellectual development, while Saxon political innovations influenced constitutional development throughout medieval Europe. The sophisticated legal systems, administrative institutions, and cultural achievements of Saxon civilization provided essential foundations for later English development, while contributing significantly to broader European medieval culture. Modern historical scholarship has increasingly recognized the Saxon period as a time of remarkable cultural creativity and institutional innovation rather than a dark age of barbarism and decline. The governmental systems developed by Saxon kings created unprecedented administrative efficiency, while Saxon legal traditions established principles of justice and community participation that would influence legal development for centuries. The literary achievements of Saxon poets and chroniclers created works of lasting artistic and historical value, while Saxon contributions to European monasticism helped preserve classical learning during periods of political instability. The enduring influence of Saxon civilization extends far beyond the boundaries of medieval England to encompass fundamental aspects of modern English-speaking culture, including legal principles, governmental institutions, linguistic structures, and cultural values that derive ultimately from Saxon foundations. The common law tradition that characterizes legal systems throughout the English-speaking world traces its origins to Saxon legal practices that emphasize community participation, procedural fairness, and the principle that law should serve justice rather than merely royal will. The parliamentary institutions that became central to democratic development evolved from Saxon assemblies that established precedents for representative government and popular participation in political decision. The linguistic legacy of Saxon civilization continues to influence English language development as new words are formed using Saxon grammatical patterns and vocabulary elements. While the place name heritage preserves Saxon territorial organization and settlement patterns across the English landscape, the literary traditions established by Saxon poets and chroniclers influenced English literary development, while preserving Germanic cultural values that contributed to the distinctive character of English civilization. The historical consciousness created by Saxon chroniclers established traditions of national historical writing that influenced English identity formation, while providing invaluable records of early medieval European development. The Saxon legacy represents one of the most significant and enduring contributions to European medieval civilization, providing institutional foundations, cultural achievements, and intellectual traditions that influence development throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. Their sophisticated governmental systems, innovative legal institutions, remarkable literary achievements, and preservation of classical learning created lasting contributions to human civilization that continue to influence modern society. The Saxon transformation of post-Roman Britain from a collection of fragmented territories into a unified kingdom with sophisticated institutions and rich cultural traditions stands as one of the great achievements of early medieval European civilization, whose influence extends far beyond the political boundaries of their time to shape the fundamental character of English-speaking civilization. Saxon grammatical structures, including word order patterns, inflectional systems, and syntactic relationships, provided the underlying framework that absorbed French vocabulary, while maintaining distinctively Germanic characteristics that differentiate English from Romance languages despite extensive French influence. The place name evidence across England reveals the extent of Saxon settlement and the persistence of Saxon linguistic patterns even in areas that experienced intensive Norman colonization. Thousands of English villages, towns, and geographical features bear names that derive from Old English elements, creating a linguistic landscape that preserves Saxon territorial organization and settlement patterns. The systematic analysis of place name elements reveals Saxon administrative divisions, territorial boundaries, and settlement hierarchies that continue to influence local organization long after the Norman conquest. River names, hill names, and other topographical features frequently preserve pre-Saxon Celtic elements that were adopted and transmitted by Saxon settlers, demonstrating the complex linguistic layering that characterizes English geographical nomenclature. The hundreds of Old English words that entered the basic vocabulary of modern English include fundamental terms for kinship relationships, household activities, agricultural practices, and social concepts that reflect the central concerns of Saxon society. Words like king, earl, knight, lord, and lady preserve Saxon social hierarchies, while house, home, hearth, barn, and yard reflect Saxon domestic arrangements. Agricultural terminology, including field, plow, harvest, sheep, cow, and pig, demonstrates the continued importance of Saxon farming traditions. While legal concepts like law, right, wrong, guilt, and doom preserve Saxon judicial principles that influenced English legal development for centuries. The grammatical structures that English inherited from Saxon include the basic patterns of verb conjugation, noun declension, and sentence construction that distinguish English from continental European languages. Despite extensive French vocabulary borrowing, the Saxon preference for compound words created English formations like understand, overcome, withdraw, and uphold that combine simple elements to express complex concepts, a pattern that continues to generate new English vocabulary. The alliterative verse traditions that characterize Saxon poetry influenced English poetic development well into the medieval period, with works like Piers Plowman employing alliterative techniques that derived from pre-conquest Saxon literary traditions. The legal institutions that emerged from Saxon governmental traditions provided the foundation for English common law development that would eventually influence legal systems throughout the English-speaking world. The concept of trial by jury evolved from Saxon practices that required community participation in judicial proceedings. While the emphasis on precedent and customary law reflected Saxon approaches to legal decision-making that prioritized traditional practices over written codes. The 100 courts and shy courts established by Saxon administrators provided the institutional framework for local justice that continued under Norman rule, with only minor modifications, ensuring continuity in legal procedures that connected post-conquest developments to pre-conquest traditions. Saxon legal concepts, including the distinction between criminal and civil cases, the use of monetary compensation for crimes, and the principle that legal procedures should be accessible to all free men, influenced English legal development in ways that distinguished it from continental European systems based on Roman law. The Saxon emphasis on community involvement in legal proceedings created participatory traditions that eventually evolved into the jury system that became central to English and American legal practice. The detailed legal codes produced by Saxon kings like Alfred, Aina, and Ethelstan established precedents for systematic legal reform that influenced later English legal development, while preserving Germanic legal principles that emphasized restitution over punishment. The parliamentary institutions that would become central to English political development traced their origins to Saxon assemblies that required royal consultation with nobles and other prominent men before implementing major policy decisions. The vintner that advised Saxon kings provided the institutional precedent for the later development of parliament. While the principle that taxation required popular consent derived from Saxon practices that made royal revenue collection dependent on community cooperation. The concept of representative government that would eventually characterize English political development reflected Saxon traditions that emphasized collective decision-making and community participation in governance. Saxon governmental innovations, including the division of territory into shire and hundreds, created administrative frameworks that proved so effective that they continued virtually unchanged under Norman rule and provided the foundation for English local government that persisted into the modern period. The office of sheriff evolved directly from Saxon rees who administered local territories on behalf of the king, while the county courts that became central to English judicial administration derived from Saxon shire courts that had provided forums for legal proceedings and administrative coordination. The sophisticated record-keeping systems that enabled the Domesday survey built upon Saxon administrative practices that had created unprecedented governmental efficiency in early medieval Europe. The cultural and literary heritage preserved by Saxon civilization included not only the remarkable achievements of Anglo-Saxon literature, but also the broader Germanic heroic traditions that influenced European medieval culture. The epic poem Beowulf stands as one of the greatest literary achievements of early medieval Europe, combining sophisticated poetic techniques with profound exploration of themes including leadership, loyalty, mortality, and a relationship between individual achievement and social responsibility. The poem's treatment of kingship, warrior culture, and social obligation provided models for medieval political thought while preserving Germanic cultural values that influenced European aristocratic ideals for centuries. The historical writing traditions established by Saxon chroniclers created new forms of vernacular historical literature that influenced European historiographical development, while preserving invaluable records of early medieval political, social, and cultural developments. The Domesday Book survey of 1086 revealed the extent of social and economic transformation that had occurred during the first 20 years of Norman rule, as the systematic replacement of Saxon landholders with Norman nobles had transferred virtually all major states to continental European control. The survey documented the remarkable administrative capabilities that the Norman regime had inherited from its Saxon predecessors, while revealing the thoroughness with which the conquest had eliminated Saxon political power. The detailed information recorded in Domesday demonstrates the continued effectiveness of Anglo-Saxon governmental systems under Norman direction. The gradual replacement of Saxon nobles with Norman appointees proceeded through a combination of military conquest, legal dispossession, and strategic marriages that transferred Saxon estates to Norman control while maintaining the appearance of legal continuity. William's policy of confiscating the lands of those who had opposed him at Hastings or in subsequent rebellions provided vast estates that could be distributed to Norman followers as rewards for their service. The legal mechanisms employed for these transfers adapted Norman feudal concepts to English tenurial traditions, while ensuring that land grants carried military obligations that supported continued Norman military supremacy. The transformation of English ecclesiastical leadership paralleled the secular changes as Norman archbishops and bishops gradually replaced Saxon ecclesiastical authorities while implementing continental European religious reforms that aligned English church practices with the broader European developments. Lanfranc's appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070 marked the beginning of systematic ecclesiastical reform that introduced continental European monastic traditions, architectural styles, and educational methods, while maintaining the organizational structures that had made the Anglo-Saxon Church one of the most sophisticated in Europe. The linguistic transformation that accompanied Norman rule created a trilingual society in which Latin served ecclesiastical and administrative functions. Norman French became the language of the court and aristocracy, and Old English persisted among the general population while gradually absorbing French vocabulary and grammatical influences. This linguistic complexity reflected the social stratification that characterized post-conquest England, with language serving as a marker of social status and cultural identity that reinforced the political dominance of the Norman elite. The resistance movements that emerged during the early years of Norman rule demonstrated both the depth of Saxon resentment and the effectiveness of Norman counterinsurgency methods in suppressing organized opposition. The rebellion of Edwin and Morcar in 1068 represented the last attempt by major Saxon nobles to organize systematic resistance. But their defeat and subsequent flight to Scotland eliminated the possibility of coordinated Saxon military opposition to Norman rule. The capture and imprisonment of these ears demonstrated William's determination to eliminate potential sources of Saxon leadership, while showing mercy to those who submitted to Norman authority. Here, the Wakes resistance in the fenlands of East Anglia attracted Saxon refugees and Danish allies, who hoped to reverse the Norman conquest through guerrilla warfare that exploited the difficult terrain of the marshlands. Hereward's forces established bases on the Isle of Ely that provided secure refuge for resistance activities while conducting raids against Norman garrisons and supply lines throughout East Anglia. The effectiveness of this resistance required intimate knowledge of local terrain combined with support from Saxon populations who provided intelligence, supplies, and recruits for continued operations against Norman forces. The siege of Ely in 1071 demonstrated the resources that William could mobilize against resistance movements as Norman forces constructed causeways across the marshlands while employing siege techniques that gradually reduced the defensive advantages that had protected Hereward's forces. The capture of Ely eliminated the last major center of organized Saxon resistance, while demonstrating the futility of opposing Norman military superiority. Hereward's legendary escape from the siege became part of Saxon folklore that preserved memories of resistance, while acknowledging the reality of Norman victory. The cultural assimilation that gradually occurred during the late 11th century created hybrid forms of identity that combined Saxon Norman, and broader European influences, while maintaining distinct regional characteristics that reflected the complex heritage of post-conquest England. Intermarriage between Norman and Saxon families, particularly among the lesser nobility, created new forms of cultural synthesis that would eventually produce the distinctive Anglo-Norman civilization of the 12th century. The architectural achievements of this period, including the great Norman cathedrals and monasteries, demonstrated the resources available to the new regime while creating monuments that would define English religious architecture for centuries. The Norman conquest of 1066 marked the end of Saxon political independence. But the cultural, linguistic, and institutional foundations laid by Saxon civilization would prove far more enduring than the military defeat at Hastings. The sophisticated governmental systems, legal traditions, and social structures that had evolved over 5 centuries of Saxon rule provided the institutional framework upon which Norman administrators would build their new regime, creating a hybrid Anglo-Norman civilization that preserved essential Saxon elements while incorporating continental European innovations. The remarkable administrative efficiency that enabled William to conduct the Domesday survey within 20 years of the conquest relied heavily on the shire and hundred systems the Saxon kings had developed. While the legal procedures recorded in Norman documents drew extensively on Anglo-Saxon precedents that had been refined through centuries of practical application, the linguistic legacy of Saxon civilization represents perhaps the most fundamental and lasting contribution to English culture, as Old English provided the grammatical structure and basic vocabulary that would survive Norman French influence to emerge as Middle English and eventually Modern English. The core vocabulary of everyday life, words for family relationships, basic activities, natural phenomena, and emotional states derives overwhelmingly from Saxon roots that prove too deeply embedded in popular usage to be displaced by Norman French alternatives. The integration of these different military arms required sophisticated tactical coordination that represented the culmination of decades of Norman military development. The Battle of Hastings began with Norman archers attempting to weaken the Saxon shield wall through sustained missile fire. But the English defensive formation proved remarkably resilient against these initial attacks. The Saxon shields overlapped in the traditional manner provided effective protection against arrows, while the elevated position reduced the effectiveness of Norman archery. The failure of the initial Norman assault demonstrated the continued effectiveness of traditional Saxon defensive tactics when properly employed on favorable terrain. The Norman cavalry charges that followed the archery bombardment encountered the full strength of the Saxon shield wall, with English warriors using their long-handled battle axes to devastating effect against horses and riders who ventured too close to their defensive line. The Beer Tapestry depicts the ferocity of these encounters, showing Norman knights being pulled from their horses by Saxon warriors while battle axes cleave through armor and shields. The initial cavalry attacks achieved no breakthrough, forcing William to adapt his tactics to counter the effectiveness of Saxon defensive methods. The crisis that developed when rumors spread that William had been killed revealed the importance of personal leadership in medieval warfare, as Norman forces began to waver until the Duke removed his helmet to show his face and rally his troops. This moment demonstrated the psychological factors that could determine the outcome of medieval battles, where the death or apparent death of a commander could trigger the collapse of entire armies regardless of their tactical position. William's survival and visible leadership enabled the Norman forces to maintain their cohesion during the most critical phase of the battle. The feigned retreats that William employed later in the battle exploited the discipline problems that had always plagued Saxon military organization, as portions of the English shield wall broke formation to pursue apparently fleeing Norman cavalry. These tactical innovations required sophisticated coordination between different Norman military units, with cavalry forces conducting coordinated withdrawals that drew Saxon warriors away from their defensive positions before turning to attack the isolated pursuers. The success of these maneuvers gradually weakened the Saxon defensive line while maintaining Norman tactical initiative. The death of Harold Godwinson late in the battle eliminated the central leadership that held the Saxon army together, triggering the collapse of organized English resistance despite the continued effectiveness of portions of the shield wall. Contemporary accounts describe Harold's death from an arrow wound to the eye, though the exact circumstances remain disputed among medieval chroniclers. The loss of the king and his brothers Gurth and Leofwine eliminated the core of Saxon leadership, while demoralizing the remaining English forces who had fought with remarkable tenacity throughout the day. The immediate aftermath of Hastings saw the complete disintegration of organized Saxon resistance as the survivors of Harold's army scattered to their home territories, while William's forces began the systematic occupation of southeastern England. The Norman victory had eliminated not only the reigning king, but also much of the Anglo-Saxon military leadership, creating a power vacuum that William moved quickly to fill through the establishment of Norman garrisons at strategic locations. The speed of the Norman advance after Hastings reflected both the completeness of their victory and the absence of alternative English leadership capable of organizing continued resistance. William's march on London demonstrated the psychological impact of the Hastings victory as major English nobles and ecclesiastical leaders submitted to Norman authority rather than attempting to organize further resistance. The submission of Edgar Atheling, the last male representative of the House of Wessex, symbolized the end of Saxon royal authority while providing William with legitimacy that eased the transition to Norman rule. The coronation of William as King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey marked the formal beginning of Norman rule, while maintaining the ceremonial continuity that connected the new regime to Anglo-Saxon governmental traditions. The establishment of Norman administrative control required the systematic replacement of Saxon officials with Norman appointees who possessed both the military capability to maintain order and the administrative skills necessary to operate the sophisticated governmental machinery that they had inherited from their predecessors. William's initial appointments concentrated on securing military control through the installation of Norman castellans at major fortified centers, while gradually extending Norman authority into the complex network of Shia and hundred courts that had provided the foundation for Anglo-Saxon local government. The construction of Norman castles throughout England represented a revolutionary change in military architecture that provided secure bases for Norman garrisons while demonstrating the permanence of the conquest to Saxon populations. The modern Bailey fortifications that appeared across the landscape during the first years of Norman rule could be constructed rapidly using local labor and materials while providing defensive capabilities that were virtually impregnable to Saxon military methods. Archaeological evidence from early Norman castle sites reveals the speed of their construction and the sophisticated engineering knowledge that Norman military architects brought to their defensive preparations. The harrying of the north in 1069-70 represented the most systematic and brutal aspect of Norman occupation policy, as William responded to Yorkshire rebellions with a campaign of devastation that eliminated organized resistance, while creating a wasteland that could not support future rebellions. The Norman forces systematically destroyed crops, livestock, agricultural tools, and storage facilities throughout Yorkshire and adjacent counties, creating famine conditions that persisted for years and reduced the population through starvation and immigration. Contemporary chroniclers describe the severity of this devastation, with some areas remaining uninhabited for decades after the Norman campaign. The coastal defenses established along the southern shore included not only permanent fortifications, but also mobile forces positioned to respond rapidly to invasion attempts at various landing sites. Harold's strategy required maintaining these defensive positions throughout the summer sailing season, while keeping substantial forces available for deployment against potential northern threats. The strain of maintaining such extensive defensive preparations for months tested the resources of even the wealthy English kingdom. The Norwegian invasion that materialized in September 1066 caught Harold's forces positioned primarily along the southern coast, requiring rapid redeployment of military resources to counter Harold at a substantial army that had landed in Yorkshire with the support of Harold's exiled brother Tostig. The Norwegian force included an estimated 300 ships, carrying perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 warriors, representing one of the largest invasion armies assembled during the medieval period. Hardrada's forces included not only Norwegian troops, but also warriors recruited from throughout Scandinavia, creating a formidable military coalition that posed a serious threat to Harold's newly established reign. The Battle of Fulford on September 20th, 1066 demonstrated both the continuing effectiveness of Scandinavian military methods and the vulnerability of English forces when caught without adequate preparation. The Earls Edwin and Morcar, commanding the northern English forces, attempted to prevent the Norwegian advance on York, but suffered a devastating defeat that eliminated organized resistance in Yorkshire, while opening the path to the kingdom's second most important city. The Norwegian victory at Fulford forced Harold to abandon his southern defensive positions and march north with whatever forces he could rapidly assemble, leaving the Channel coast vulnerable to Norman invasion. Harold's march north with his household troops represented one of the most remarkable logistical achievements in medieval military history, as the king covered the 190 m from London to Yorkshire in just 4 days while maintaining his army's combat effectiveness. The speed of this movement reflected both the efficiency of Anglo-Saxon administrative systems and the quality of the kingdom's road network, which enabled rapid communication and troop movement that gave English forces crucial tactical advantages. Harold's ability to surprise the Norwegian forces at Stamford Bridge resulted from this rapid deployment, combined with effective intelligence gathering that revealed the enemy's dispositions and defensive preparations. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September the 25th, 1066, marked the end of the Viking Age as a major factor in English politics, with Harold's forces achieving a decisive victory that eliminated Hardrada and shattered the Norwegian invasion force. The battle began with individual combat between a Norwegian warrior who held the bridge against the entire English army, until an Anglo-Saxon soldier floated beneath the bridge in a barrel and speared him from below. The main engagement that followed saw Harold's forces employ traditional Saxon shield wall tactics, enhanced by improved weapons and armor that proved superior to Norwegian equipment and methods. The completeness of the English victory was demonstrated by the fact that only 24 of the original 300 Norwegian ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The aftermath of Stamford Bridge left Harold's army depleted and exhausted at the moment when Norman forces finally launched their invasion, landing at Peveny on September the 28th while the English king was still in Yorkshire celebrating his victory over the Norwegians. William's timing proved fortunate as the delay caused by contrary winds had allowed Harold to eliminate the northern threat before facing the Norman invasion. The Norman landing encountered no organized resistance, enabling William's forces to establish secure beachheads while beginning the construction of fortifications that would protect their base of operations during the coming campaign. William's initial strategy after landing involved the systematic devastation of the surrounding countryside, a calculated policy designed to force Harold into battle while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to Norman rule. The Bayeux Tapestry depicts Norman soldiers burning buildings and seizing livestock, activities that served both practical purposes of supplying the invasion force and psychological objectives of undermining support for Harold's regime. Archaeological evidence from sites in Sussex reveals layers of destruction dating to this period, confirming the extent of Norman devastation, while illustrating the brutal reality of medieval warfare against civilian populations. Harold's decision to march south immediately after Stamford Bridge reflected both the urgency of a Norman threat and the strategic miscalculation that would prove fatal to Saxon independence. Rather than allowing time for the assembly of additional forces from throughout the kingdom, Harold chose to confront William with whatever troops he could rapidly gather, including many who had fought at Stamford Bridge and endured the exhausting march from Yorkshire. The king's household troops formed the core of his army, supplemented by levers from the southern shire who joined the royal forces during the march toward the Norman positions. The English army that assembled on Senlac Hill on the morning of October 14th, 1066 represented the final flowering of Saxon military tradition, with heavily armed infantry forming the shield wall that had proven effective against Viking raiders and continental enemies for centuries. Harold's forces occupied a strong defensive position on elevated ground with their flanks protected by difficult terrain that would channel Norman attacks into the center of the English line. The Saxon warriors carried the traditional weapons of their ancestors, spears, battle axes, and swords, while wearing mail armor that provided protection against Norman arrows and cavalry charges. The Norman army that faced the Saxons at Hastings demonstrated the military innovations that had made continental European warfare increasingly sophisticated during the 11th century. William's forces included three distinct components: heavy cavalry armed with lances and mounted on specially bred war horses, infantry equipped with spears and shields similar to Saxon equipment, and archers whose crossbows and composite bows provided long-range striking capability that the English forces lacked. The military reforms implemented during the reign of Edward the Confessor included the recruitment of continental European military specialists who brought knowledge of new tactical methods, siege techniques, and military technologies that enhanced Anglo-Saxon military capabilities. The presence of Norman, Flemish, and French warriors in royal service introduced cavalry tactics, crossbow technology, and siege warfare methods that would prove crucial in subsequent military campaigns. These foreign military advisors also provided intelligence about continental military developments, while serving as diplomatic links with potential allies and enemies across the Channel. The naval developments of this period reflected the continued importance of maritime defense in protecting English territories from Scandinavian and continental threats. The royal fleets maintained by Anglo-Saxon kings included both traditional long ships adapted for coastal defense and larger vessels designed for extended operations in the North Sea and English Channel. These fleets required sophisticated logistical support, including specialized harbors, supply systems, and recruitment mechanisms that could provide the trained crews necessary for effective naval operations. The archaeological evidence for shipbuilding activities at sites like London and Southampton reveals the technological sophistication achieved by Anglo-Saxon shipwrights, while demonstrating the resources committed to naval defense. The response to renewed Viking threats during the reign of Ethelred the Unready revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the mature Anglo-Saxon state. The sophisticated administrative and military systems proved capable of mobilizing unprecedented resources while struggling to counter the tactical innovations employed by new generations of Scandinavian raiders. The payment of Danegeld represented a pragmatic response to Viking pressure that utilized the kingdom's advanced monetary system to purchase temporary peace while providing time for military preparations. However, the enormous sums involved in these payments, totaling over 150,000 of silver during Ethelred's reign, strained royal finances, while encouraging further Viking expeditions attracted by the prospect of substantial profits. The military campaigns of Sween Forkbeard and Kennet demonstrated the evolution of Viking warfare from the raiding tactics of earlier centuries to systematic conquest campaigns that incorporated continental European military methods with traditional Scandinavian naval superiority. These campaigns employed coordinated land and sea operations, sophisticated intelligence gathering, and diplomatic initiatives that isolated Anglo-Saxon resistance, while building coalitions of English nobles willing to accept Scandinavian rule. The success of these campaigns reflected not only military superiority, but also the political sophistication that characterized 11th century Scandinavian kingship. The reign of Ket as King of England created a North Sea empire that connected English resources with Scandinavian military power and continental European diplomatic networks, demonstrating the international significance achieved by the Anglo-Saxon kingdom during its final century. Cian's administrative policies combined respect for English legal and governmental traditions with innovations borrowed from continental European royal practice, creating hybrid governmental forms that maintained administrative efficiency while accommodating the diverse populations under his rule. The cultural synthesis that characterized Cut's reign produced artistic and literary achievements that reflected the cosmopolitan character of his court, while maintaining distinctively English characteristics. The restoration of the House of Wessex under Edward the Confessor marked the final phase of independent Anglo-Saxon rule, characterized by continued cultural achievements and administrative sophistication that occurred alongside growing continental European influence that would ultimately facilitate the Norman conquest. Edward's continental connections established during his long exile in Normandy introduced new architectural styles, artistic influences, and political relationships that gradually transformed the character of English court culture while maintaining traditional Anglo-Saxon governmental and legal institutions. The tension between continuity and change that characterized Edward's reign created the conditions that would enable William of Normandy to claim the English throne while ensuring that the conquest would encounter sophisticated resistance from a kingdom that had achieved remarkable political and cultural maturity. The death of Edward the Confessor on January 5th, 1066 precipitated the most decisive succession crisis in English history as three formidable claimants assembled armies to contest the throne of the most prosperous kingdom in northwestern Europe. Harold Godwinson's coronation the day after Edward's death represented the culmination of his family's decadal-long accumulation of power and influence. Yet his claim rested primarily on Edward's alleged deathbed designation and the Wittenokimat's immediate approval rather than blood relationship to the royal house. Across the Channel, William of Normandy prepared for invasion based on his assertion that Edward had promised him the succession years earlier, and that Harold had sworn to support his claim during a diplomatic mission to Normandy. Meanwhile, Harold Hardrada of Norway marshaled forces for his own invasion, claiming the English throne through agreements allegedly made between his predecessor Magnus and Herrenut decades earlier. The military preparations undertaken by each claimant revealed the sophisticated logistical capabilities that 11th century rulers could mobilize for major campaigns. William's invasion force required the construction of a substantial fleet capable of transporting not only thousands of warriors, but also their horses, equipment, and supplies necessary for extended operations in hostile territory. Norman chroniclers described the assembly of over 700 vessels at the mouth of the Dives River with specialized horse transports designed to carry the heavy cavalry that formed the core of William's military advantage. The Duke's diplomatic efforts secured papal blessing for his enterprise, transforming what might have appeared as naked aggression into a righteous campaign to restore legitimate authority and reform the English Church according to continental standards. Harold Godwinson's defensive preparations demonstrated the administrative sophistication of the Anglo-Saxon state, as the king mobilized both the professional household troops and the broader feared system that could theoretically place every able-bodied freeman under arms. The cultural achievements of this period encompassed architectural innovations, manuscript production, and scholarly activities that rivaled contemporary developments in continental Europe while maintaining distinctively English characteristics that reflected the synthesis of Saxon, Scandinavian, and continental influences. The late Saxon churches that were constructed during the 10th and 11th centuries demonstrate sophisticated architectural knowledge that incorporated continental Romanesque elements while adapting to local materials and building traditions. These structures typically featured stone construction with elaborate decorative elements, including carved capitals, sculptural programs, and architectural details that reveal contact with continental artistic developments, while maintaining distinctively English stylistic characteristics. The Church of St. Lawrence at Bradford-on-Avon exemplifies the architectural sophistication achieved by late Saxon builders, with its carefully proportioned nave, elaborate sculptural decoration, and sophisticated masonry techniques that demonstrate mastery of advanced building methods. The structure's architectural details reveal knowledge of continental Romanesque developments, while incorporating decorative elements that reflect specifically English artistic traditions. Similar achievements can be observed at churches throughout England, where late Saxon builders created structures that combined functional efficiency with aesthetic sophistication while serving the liturgical requirements of Reformed Benedictine monasticism. The manuscript production centers that flourished during this period created some of the finest illuminated books produced anywhere in medieval Europe, combining sophisticated artistic techniques with scholarly content that reflected the intellectual achievements of the Benedictine Reform movement. The Winchester School of Manuscript Illumination achieved international recognition for its distinctive style that combined Byzantine artistic influences with Carolean decorative traditions and indigenous English elements. The manuscripts produced at Winchester and other centers demonstrate sophisticated understanding of classical artistic principles while developing innovative approaches to page layout, decorative integration, and iconographic programs that enhance the spiritual and intellectual impact of their contents. The Benedictional of St. Ethelwald represents perhaps the finest achievement of Anglo-Saxon manuscript art, with its elaborate miniatures, sophisticated decorative borders, and innovative use of gold and silver that created visual effects of unprecedented richness and complexity. The manuscript's artistic program reveals detailed knowledge of continental European artistic developments while demonstrating the distinctive aesthetic sensibilities that characterized English artistic production during this period. The technical sophistication evident in the manuscript's production required specialized knowledge of pigment preparation, gold leaf application, and parchment treatment that indicates the existence of highly trained scriptrums with access to expensive materials and advanced artistic knowledge. The scholarly activities centered in Reformed Benedictine monasteries created intellectual achievements that contributed significantly to European learning while preserving and transmitting classical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The monastic schools established at Winchester, Glastonbury, Abington, and other centers provided education that combined traditional liberal arts instruction with specialized training in theology, canon law, and liturgical studies. These institutions attracted students from throughout Europe while maintaining correspondence with continental scholars that facilitated intellectual exchange and collaborative scholarly projects. Alfred emerged as one of the most significant scholars of the period, producing educational works that made sophisticated theological and philosophical concepts accessible to English audiences while maintaining scholarly standards that earned international recognition. His Catholic homilies provided systematic theological instruction adapted to the needs of parish clergy, while his Lives of Saints created vernacular hagiographical literature that combined scholarly accuracy with popular appeal. The linguistic sophistication of Alfred's prose demonstrates the maturity achieved by Old English as a literary and scholarly medium capable of expressing complex intellectual concepts with precision and elegance. The development of vernacular historical writing during this period created new forms of historical consciousness that combined Christian providential history with Germanic heroic traditions and contemporary political concerns. The various versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle produced at different monastic centers reveal sophisticated approaches to historical writing that incorporated multiple sources while maintaining distinctive regional perspectives on national events. The chroniclers demonstrated remarkable skill in organizing complex historical material while providing interpretive frameworks that helped readers understand the significance of contemporary developments within broader historical contexts. Military innovations during this period reflected the ongoing challenges posed by renewed Viking activity and the eventual Norman threat, forcing Anglo-Saxon military leaders to adapt traditional tactics while incorporating new technologies and organizational methods borrowed from continental European warfare. The household troops that formed the core of royal armies evolved from traditional Germanic war bands into professional military units equipped with standardized weapons and trained in coordinated tactical maneuvers. These forces typically included heavily armored infantry armed with spears, swords, and large shields supported by archers and cavalry units that provided tactical flexibility in different combat situations. The development of castle-building techniques during the 11th century represented a significant departure from traditional Saxon fortification methods, with the construction of modern Bailey fortifications that incorporated continental European military architecture while adapting to English defensive requirements. These fortifications typically featured artificial mounds topped with wooden towers and surrounded by enclosed courtyards protected by earthwork defenses and wooden palisades. The rapid construction techniques employed in building these fortifications enabled defensive preparations that could respond quickly to changing military threats while providing secure bases for offensive operations. The administrative machinery that emerged during the 10th century represented a remarkable synthesis of Saxon governmental traditions with innovations borrowed from Carolingian and Byzantine models, creating centralized institutions that could coordinate activities across territories stretching from Cornwall to Northland while maintaining the flexibility necessary to accommodate regional variations in law, custom, and economic organization. The royal household evolved from the personal retinue of warrior kings into a complex bureaucratic apparatus staffed by literate officials who maintained written records, administered royal estates, and coordinated the collection of taxes and military obligations that provided the material foundation for royal authority. The development of Shia administration under Edgar and his successors created a hierarchical governmental structure that extended royal authority into every corner of the kingdom through appointed officials whose responsibilities encompassed judicial, military, and fiscal functions. Each shire was governed by an older whose authority derived directly from royal appointment and who served as the king's representative in all matters of local governance. These officials typically controlled substantial personal estates that provided them with the economic resources necessary to maintain their position while ensuring their continued loyalty to the crown through the careful distribution of royal patronage. The Shia courts that met regularly under alderman supervision provided forums for the administration of justice, the resolution of disputes, and the conduct of administrative business that connected local communities directly to royal authority. Beneath the eldermen, the reeves who administered individual hundreds created an additional layer of royal authority that penetrated to the village level, ensuring that royal commands could be transmitted throughout the kingdom while providing mechanisms for the upward flow of information about local conditions, potential threats, and available resources. The 100 courts that met monthly under Reeves' supervision handled the vast majority of legal disputes, while serving as venues for the proclamation of royal legislation and the coordination of local contributions to royal military campaigns. This administrative network created unprecedented governmental capacity that enabled Anglo-Saxon kings to mobilize resources more effectively than any previous English rulers while maintaining detailed knowledge of conditions throughout their territories. The royal writing office that developed during this period produced the stream of writs charters and administrative documents that provided the legal and bureaucratic foundation for centralized governance. These documents reveal sophisticated approaches to record-keeping that incorporated continental European diplomatic practices while adapting to specifically English legal and administrative requirements. The standardization of documentary forms, the development of distinctive Anglo-Saxon diplomatic protocols, and the maintenance of comprehensive archives created governmental capabilities that enable consistent policy implementation across vast territories while preserving the legal precedents necessary for effective judicial administration. The survival of thousands of these documents provides unprecedented insight into the daily operations of Anglo-Saxon government and the remarkable administrative sophistication that characterized the mature Anglo-Saxon state. The economic prosperity that supported these governmental innovations rested upon agricultural improvements, commercial expansion, and monetary developments that generated unprecedented levels of surplus wealth for both royal and private consumption. The agricultural revolution of the 10th and 11th centuries involved the introduction of new crops, improved farming techniques, and more efficient land management practices that significantly increased productivity while supporting larger populations. The widespread adoption of the heavy plow enabled the cultivation of previously marginal soils, while the development of systematic crop rotation maintained soil fertility while maximizing yields. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements revealed substantial population growth during this period, with new villages established in previously uninhabited areas and existing settlements expanding beyond their original boundaries. The expansion of commercial activity during this period created urban centers that serve as focal points for regional and long-distance trade, while generating the tax revenues that supported royal administration and military activities. Towns like Winchester, London, York, and Chester developed into substantial commercial centers with populations numbering in the thousands, supported by craft production, trade, and administrative functions that created economic opportunities for merchants, artisans, and service providers. The archaeological record from these urban centers reveals sophisticated commercial infrastructure, including specialized workshops, storage facilities, and residential areas that accommodated diverse populations engaged in various economic activities. The monetary system that emerged during the 10th century represented one of the most advanced in contemporary Europe, with standardized silver pennies produced at royal mints throughout the kingdom under strict quality controls that ensured consistent weight and purity. The regular recoinage programs implemented by Anglo-Saxon kings prevented the debasement and where that plagued other medieval monetary systems while generating substantial revenues for the royal treasury. The geographical distribution of mint locations reveals the extent of royal administrative control, with mints operating in over 60 locations during the reign of Ethelred the Unready, each producing coins that bore the king's image and titles while conforming to exacting standards of weight and silver content. The sophistication of Anglo-Saxon monetary policy extended beyond simple coinage to encompass complex fiscal arrangements, including the collection of taxes, the payment of military wages, and the administration of royal estates that generated revenues supporting governmental operations. The gel system that developed during this period created mechanisms for the systematic collection of taxes based on land assessments that could be adjusted to meet changing royal financial requirements. The ability to collect taxes in silver coin rather than agricultural produce or labor service provided Anglo-Saxon kings with unprecedented flexibility in military and administrative planning, while creating monetary circulation that facilitated commercial development throughout the kingdom. These naval victories provided crucial psychological benefits by demonstrating that Viking maritime superiority was not absolute, while offering practical advantages by disrupting Viking supply lines and reducing their operational flexibility. The establishment of the Danelaw through the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum around 886 created a formal division of England that recognized Viking territorial control over large areas of eastern and northern England, while establishing boundaries and legal frameworks for ongoing coexistence. The treaty defined the frontier between Saxon and Viking territories along a line running roughly from London to Chester, with detailed provisions for trade relationships, legal procedures, and diplomatic protocols that would govern interactions between the two populations. The agreement represented a pragmatic recognition that neither side possessed the military capability to achieve complete victory, while establishing frameworks that could prevent minor disputes from escalating into renewed warfare. The Danelaw's internal organization reflected the adaptation of Scandinavian political and legal traditions to the realities of governing settled agricultural populations in England. Viking settlers established administrative centers at major towns including York, Lincoln, Stamford, Leicester, and Derby, creating a network of fortified bases that could coordinate military activities while serving as commercial and judicial centers for surrounding rural areas. The legal system that developed in these territories combined elements of Scandinavian law with Saxon legal traditions and practical adaptations to local conditions, creating hybrid legal cultures that would influence English legal development for centuries. The cultural impact of Danelaw settlement extended far beyond simple political control to encompass fundamental changes in language, place names, social organization, and economic activities that reflected the integration of Scandinavian and Saxon populations. Archaeological evidence from Danelaw settlements reveals material culture that combines Scandinavian and Saxon elements with pottery styles, metalwork techniques, and building construction methods that reflects cultural synthesis rather than simple conquest. The linguistic evidence for this cultural integration includes the adoption of hundreds of Scandinavian words into English vocabulary, particularly terms related to legal concepts, agricultural practices, and social relationships that indicate sustained contact and intermarriage between Viking and Saxon populations. The economic transformation of Danelaw territories involved the development of new commercial networks that connected Scandinavian England with trading partners across the North Sea and Baltic regions. Viking merchants established trading relationships that brought Scandinavian goods, including amber, furs, and specialized metalwork to English markets while exporting English agricultural products, textiles, and manufactured goods to Scandinavian and continental European customers. The presence of Scandinavian coins and commercial weights in English archaeological sites demonstrates the extent of these commercial relationships while revealing the sophisticated commercial practices that Viking settlers brought to their new territories. The reconquest campaigns initiated by Edward the Elder represented the beginning of systematic efforts to reunite England under Saxon rule, with military strategies that built upon Alfred's defensive innovations while developing new approaches to offensive warfare against established Viking territories. Edward's campaigns combined traditional Saxon military strengths with tactical innovations borrowed from Viking warfare, including improved cavalry forces, sophisticated siege techniques, and coordinated amphibious operations that could challenge Viking defensive advantages. The systematic nature of these campaigns involved careful preparation, including intelligence gathering, supply organization, and diplomatic efforts to isolate Viking territories from potential Scandinavian reinforcement. Ethelflaed of Mercia emerged as one of the most effective military leaders of the Reconquest period, demonstrating strategic and tactical skills that complemented her brother Edward's campaigns while extending Saxon influence into areas that had been under Viking control for decades. Her fortification of towns throughout western Mia created defensive networks that protected Saxon territories while providing bases for offensive operations against Viking strongholds. The coordination between Edward and Ethelf's campaigns reveals sophisticated strategic planning that could synchronize military operations across wide geographical areas while maintaining pressure on multiple Viking territories simultaneously. The Siege of Derby in 917 demonstrated the effectiveness of the new Saxon military methods, with Edward's forces successfully capturing one of the 5 major Viking strongholds through a combination of direct assault and strategic isolation that prevented Viking reinforcement. The campaign's success required sophisticated logistical planning that could maintain siege forces for extended periods while coordinating with other military operations that prevented Viking forces from concentrating their defensive efforts. Archaeological evidence from Derby reveals the extent of fortification works that the Vikings had constructed to defend the town, while also showing the systematic destruction that accompanied its Saxon recapture. Ethelstan's victory at the Battle of Brunand in 937 represented the culmination of the reconquest campaigns, with a decisive Saxon victory over a coalition of Viking, Scottish, and Irish forces that had threatened to reverse the territorial gains achieved by Edward and Ethel FLE. The battle involved the largest armies assembled in Britain since the Roman period, with contemporary sources describing fighting that lasted an entire day and resulted in enormous casualties on both sides. Ethelstan's victory eliminated the last serious challenge to Saxon control over northern England, while establishing his reputation as the first king to exercise effective authority over the entire English territory south of the Scottish border. The consolidation of English territory under the House of Wessex following Ethelstan's triumph at Brunanburh ushered in an era of unprecedented political sophistication that transformed the fragmented kingdoms of earlier centuries into a unified realm capable of mobilizing resources on a scale that rivaled the greatest continental powers. Archaeological evidence from Viking camps reveals sophisticated defensive earthworks, organized internal layouts, and evidence for craft production that indicates long-term occupation rather than temporary military encampments. The Viking conquest of York in 866 demonstrated their ability to capture and hold major urban centers, transforming the former Northumbrian capital into the administrative center of what would become the Kingdom of Jorvik. The Vikings' occupation of York revealed their understanding of the economic and strategic value of established urban centers, with archaeological evidence showing continued commercial activity under Viking rule alongside new forms of craft production and trade relationships. The transformation of York's street layout, building styles, and material culture reflects the gradual integration of Scandinavian and Saxon populations under Viking political control, creating hybrid cultural forms that would characterize the Danelaw for centuries. Alfred the Great's succession to the throne of Wessex in 871 occurred at the moment of greatest crisis for Anglo-Saxon England, with Viking armies controlling large portions of the country and traditional defensive systems proving inadequate against sustained Scandinavian assault. Alfred inherited a kingdom under direct military threat, with Viking forces having established permanent bases within striking distance of the West Saxon heartland, and traditional allies either conquered or neutralized by Viking expansion. The young king's initial military experiences consisted primarily of desperate defensive actions against Viking armies, whose superior mobility and tactical flexibility had overwhelmed Saxon resistance throughout eastern England. The Battle of Ashdown in 871, where Alfred served as second in command to his brother Ethelred, provided crucial insights into Viking military methods while demonstrating that Saxon forces could achieve tactical success against Viking armies under favorable conditions. Alfred's military reforms began during the darkest period of his reign, when Viking pressure had forced him to retreat to the Somerset marshes around Atheley, where he maintained organized resistance, while developing new approaches to counter Viking tactical advantages. The creation of the feared system represented Alfred's most significant military innovation, transforming the traditional Saxon obligation for military service into a systematic defensive network capable of rapid mobilization against Viking threats. The reformed fear divided the available military manpower into two groups that served alternating periods of active duty, ensuring that trained forces were always available for immediate deployment, while allowing agricultural and economic activities to continue during periods of military crisis. The feared system's effectiveness depended upon careful coordination between local commanders and royal officials who could assess threats, mobilize appropriate forces, and coordinate defensive responses across wide geographical areas. Alfred's military reforms included the establishment of standardized equipment requirements for feared service with specific provisions for weapons, armor, and supplies that ensured consistent combat capability while distributing the financial burden of military preparation across the entire population. The system incorporated lessons learned from Viking tactics, including emphasis on mobility, rapid deployment, and the ability to maintain organized resistance even when traditional defensive positions have been compromised. The Burr network that Alfred established across Wessex represented a revolutionary approach to territorial defense that combined military fortification with urban development and economic growth. These fortified centers were positioned at strategic locations throughout the kingdom, typically spaced no more than 20 m apart to ensure that no settlement was more than a day's march from defensive shelter. Each burr was designed to serve multiple functions, providing military strongholds that could resist Viking assault while serving as commercial centers that attracted merchants and craftsmen whose activities generated the economic resources necessary to maintain defensive preparations. The construction of these fortifications required massive investments of labor and materials, with archaeological evidence revealing sophisticated engineering that incorporated lessons learned from both Roman military architecture and contemporary continental fortification techniques. The Burgle HD, a document that recorded the defensive obligations associated with each burr, reveals the systematic planning that underlay Alfred's defensive strategy. Each fortified center was assigned a specific number of hides of land whose inhabitants were responsible for maintaining designated sections of the fortification walls, creating a comprehensive system that distributed defensive responsibilities while ensuring adequate manpower for both construction and garrison duties. The document specifies that each hide was responsible for maintaining 4 feet of wall, with calculations that suggest total defensive perimeters exceeding 27,000 feet across the entire network. This system created permanent defensive infrastructure that could withstand prolonged siege while providing secure bases from which Saxon forces could launch counterattacks against Viking armies. Alfred's naval innovations addressed one of the fundamental advantages that had enabled Viking success throughout the 9th century. As Saxon kingdoms had possessed no maritime forces capable of intercepting Viking fleets or preventing their access to inland targets via river systems. The construction of a royal navy required not only shipbuilding expertise, but also the development of new tactical doctrines adapted to countering Viking naval superiority. Alfred's ships were designed to be larger and more heavily armed than typical Viking vessels, with crews trained specifically for naval combat rather than the amphibious operations that characterize Viking warfare. Archaeological evidence from ship finds suggests that these vessels incorporated design elements borrowed from both Scandinavian and continental European shipbuilding traditions while adapting to the specific requirements of defensive naval operations. The naval campaigns conducted under Alfred's direction achieved notable successes against Viking fleets, with contemporary sources recording victories that demonstrated the potential effectiveness of Saxon naval forces when properly organized and equipped. The Battle of the Swale in 885 saw Alfred's ships defeat a Viking fleet attempting to raid Kent, capturing several enemy vessels and forcing the survivors to retreat without achieving their objectives. The translation movement initiated by King Alfred the Great demonstrated the potential for vernacular literature to serve educational and cultural functions previously monopolized by Latin texts, making sophisticated learning accessible to broad audiences while preserving and developing native intellectual traditions. The monastery of Lindisfarne stood as a beacon of Christian learning and artistic achievement in the Northumbrian kingdom, its scriptorium producing illuminated manuscripts that rivaled any created in continental Europe, while its library housed one of the finest collections of theological and classical texts north of the Alps. The monastic community had flourished for over a century on Holy Island, protected by the surrounding tidal waters and sustained by generous royal patronage that had made it wealthy beyond the dreams of most secular settlements. The monks rose each morning for lauds in their stone church, its walls decorated with carved crosses and painted scenes from Scripture. while the monastery's workshops produced intricate metalwork, carved ivory, and the precious books that made Lindisfarne famous throughout the Christian world. On June 8th, 793, this peaceful routine was shattered forever when Viking longships appeared off the Northumbrian coast. Their crews having navigated the treacherous waters around the island with a precision that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of local conditions. The Viking assault on Lindisfarne demonstrated tactical sophistication that went far beyond simple piratical raiding with coordinated attacks that targeted specific buildings and objectives while minimizing the raiders' exposure to potential counterattack. The attackers struck at dawn when the monks were gathered for morning prayers, using their knowledge of monastic routines to maximize surprise while ensuring that the community's portable wealth would be concentrated in easily accessible locations. The raiders systematically looted the monastery's treasury, stripping gold and silver ornaments from the altar, seizing illuminated manuscripts whose precious metal decorations could be melted down, and capturing monks who could be sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets. The attack lasted only a few hours, but its psychological impact reverberated throughout Anglo-Saxon England as news spread that even the most sacred Christian sites were vulnerable to heathen assault. The Lindisfarne raid marked the beginning of a new phase in Viking activity that would transform the political and military landscape of Anglo-Saxon England over the following century. Earlier Scandinavian contacts with Britain had involved primarily trade and diplomatic relationships with occasional small-scale raids that posed no serious threat to established kingdoms. The 793 attack revealed the existence of Viking fleets capable of striking targets hundreds of miles from their home bases, equipped with detailed intelligence about local conditions and defended by warriors whose weapons and tactics were specifically adapted to rapid amphibious operations. The success of the Lindisfarne raid encouraged further Viking expeditions that gradually escalated from isolated attacks on monasteries to systematic campaigns against major political centers. The Viking longships that carried these raiders represented the culmination of centuries of Scandinavian shipbuilding innovation, with vessels specifically designed for the shallow coastal waters and river systems that provided access to Anglo-Saxon targets. These ships typically measured between 60 and 100 feet in length with shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate rivers far inland while maintaining the structural integrity necessary for open sea voyages. The flexible construction techniques employed overlapping planks secured with iron rivets created hulls that could flex with ocean swells while remaining watertight under extreme conditions. Each ship carried crews of 30 to 60 warriors who served as both oarsmen and fighters with specialized equipment that included shields designed to protect rowers during combat and weapons optimized for fighting in confined shipboard conditions. The escalation of Viking activity during the first half of the 9th century followed patterns that revealed increasingly sophisticated strategic thinking among Scandinavian leaders who recognized the wealth and vulnerability of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Individual raids gave way to coordinated campaigns involving multiple fleets that could strike simultaneously at widely separated targets, preventing Saxon forces from concentrating their defensive efforts while maximizing the raiders' opportunities for profit. The Vikings demonstrated remarkable adaptability in their choice of targets, shifting their focus from isolated monasteries to commercial centers, royal estates, and strategic fortifications as Saxon defensive measures evolved to counter their tactics. The presence of Viking winter camps in Ireland and Scotland provided forward bases that reduced the logistical challenges of extended campaigns while offering secure retreats when Saxon resistance proved too formidable. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 represented a fundamental shift from raiding to conquest, as a coalition of Viking forces estimated to number several thousand warriors established permanent bases in Anglo-Saxon territory, with a clear intention of territorial occupation rather than temporary plunder. Contemporary sources describe this army as larger and better organized than any previous Viking force, with sophisticated supply systems, coordinated leadership, and strategic objectives that extended beyond immediate material gain to encompass long-term political control. The army's composition included not only warriors, but also craftsmen, merchants, and other specialists necessary for establishing permanent settlements. While its leadership demonstrated familiarity with Saxon political divisions and military capabilities that suggested extensive intelligence gathering and strategic planning, the Great Heathen Army's initial campaigns targeted East Anglia and Northumbria, kingdoms whose internal divisions and recent military setbacks had weakened their capacity for organized resistance. The Vikings established fortified bases at strategic locations, including York and the Ford, using these strongholds as launching points for further expansion while providing secure refuge where their forces could regroup and resupply. The army's tactical approach combined traditional Viking mobility with innovations adapted to continental warfare, including the use of cavalry forces and siege equipment that enabled them to assault fortified positions that had previously been immune to Viking attack. Major trading centers developed at strategic locations, including river mouths, coastal harbors, and road junctions, where merchants could conduct business under the protection of local authorities while accessing transportation networks that connected distant markets. The religious landscape of Saxon society reflected the complex interaction between traditional Germanic paganism and Christianity, creating syncretic belief systems that incorporated elements from both traditions while adapting to local conditions and social needs. Saxon paganism centered around a pantheon of deities associated with war, fertility, wisdom, and natural phenomena, with Woden serving as the primary god of war and kingship, through no controlling thunder and storms, and Frigg governing domestic affairs and fertility. Sacred sites included natural features like groves, springs, and hilltops, as well as constructed temples and ceremonial centers where communities gathered for religious festivals and ritual activities. The conversion to Christianity transformed Saxon religious practices while preserving many traditional elements that were reinterpreted within Christian frameworks. Sacred sites often retained their religious significance, with Christian churches constructed on locations that had been centers of pagan worship for centuries. The Christian calendar incorporated seasonal festivals that had marked important agricultural and social cycles in pagan tradition. While Christian saints assumed roles previously filled by pagan deities, the process of conversion varied considerably across different regions and social groups, with royal courts typically converting first for political reasons, while rural populations often maintained traditional practices alongside Christian observances for generations. Burial customs provide crucial insights into Saxon religious beliefs and social structures, revealing changes over time that reflect both internal social developments and external religious influences. Early Saxon burials typically involved cremation, with ashes placed in ceramic urns accompanied by grave goods that included personal possessions, weapons, and jewelry that the deceased would need in the afterlife. The presence of elaborate grave goods in high-status burials demonstrates belief in an afterlife where social distinctions continued and material possessions retained their importance. The gradual transition to inhumation burial reflects Christian influence, while preserving many traditional elements, including the continued inclusion of grave goods and the maintenance of cemetery sites that served multiple generations. The mythology preserved in Saxon literature and oral tradition reveals a worldview that emphasized heroic achievement, loyalty to kinship and lordship bonds, and acceptance of fate, while striving for glory that would ensure remembrance after death. The concept of weird, often translated as fate or destiny, played a central role in Saxon thinking about human agency and divine will, suggesting a complex understanding of causation that balanced individual responsibility with supernatural influence. Heroes in Saxon mythology typically faced impossible odds while maintaining their honor and loyalty, creating models for behavior that reinforce social values while providing entertainment and moral instruction. Festival traditions marked important transitions in the agricultural year while reinforcing community bonds and religious commitments that sustained Saxon social cohesion. The midwinter celebration known as Yule involved elaborate feasting, gift-giving, and ceremonial activities that demonstrated community prosperity while honoring ancestors and ensuring supernatural protection for the coming year. Spring festivals celebrated renewal and fertility, rituals designed to ensure successful crops and healthy livestock while marking the end of winter's hardships. Harvest celebrations provided opportunities for communities to gather, share their prosperity, and prepare for winter while honoring the deities responsible for agricultural abundance. The literary achievements of Saxon culture represent some of the most remarkable intellectual and artistic accomplishments of early medieval Europe. Combining sophisticated poetic techniques with profound exploration of themes including heroism, loyalty, mortality, and the relationship between human agency and divine will. The epic poem Beowulf stands as the greatest achievement of Saxon literature, presenting a complex narrative that weaves together heroic adventure, political commentary, and philosophical reflection within a framework of remarkable poetic artistry. The poem's treatment of kingship, warrior loyalty, and the struggle against monstrous enemies reflects Saxon social values, while exploring universal themes that transcend cultural boundaries. The composition and preservation of Beowulf required sophisticated literary culture that included not only skilled poets capable of creating complex narratives, but also scribal traditions that could record and transmit oral literature in written form. The poem demonstrates intimate knowledge of Scandinavian geography, genealogy, and legendary material, suggesting continued cultural connections between Anglo-Saxon England and the continental Germanic homeland. The archaeological correlations between the poem's material culture and actual Saxon artifacts reveal the accuracy of the poet's knowledge about weapons, jewelry, halls, and other elements of aristocratic life. Historical chronicles produced in Saxon monasteries created new forms of literature that combined Christian historical writing with Germanic narrative traditions, producing works that served both practical and artistic purposes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle represents the most ambitious attempt to create a comprehensive historical record of English events. Combining information from multiple sources, including earlier chronicles, royal records, and oral traditions, the Chronicle's treatment of political events reveals sophisticated understanding of causation and historical development, while preserving valuable information about social conditions, economic activities, and cultural changes that would otherwise be lost. The development of Old English vernacular literature represented a remarkable innovation that elevated the Germanic vernacular to a level of sophistication previously reserved for Latin, creating a literary language capable of expressing complex theological, philosophical, and artistic concepts. Saxon poets and prose writers developed sophisticated techniques for adapting Latin literary models to Germanic linguistic structures and cultural values, creating hybrid forms that combine classical learning with native traditions. Warriors who distinguished themselves in battle could expect promotion within the retinue hierarchy, with senior warriors receiving substantial grants of land that allowed them to establish their own households and recruit their own followers. This system provided mechanisms for social mobility while ensuring that military leadership remained concentrated among those who had proven their loyalty and competence through years of service. The archaeological record reveals the material rewards associated with warrior status, including elaborately decorated weapons, personal jewelry, and burial goods that reflect both individual achievement and the collective wealth of successful warbands. The free farmers known as CHS formed the backbone of Saxon society, providing the agricultural production that supported the entire social system, while serving as the primary source of military manpower for local defense and royal campaigns. These farmers typically owned small estates consisting of a family dwelling, agricultural buildings, and sufficient land to support a household that might include extended family members, servants, and occasional guests. The sole status as a free man entitled him to participate in local assemblies, bear arms in defense of his community, and seek justice through established legal procedures. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals modest but comfortable living conditions with timber-framed houses, storage buildings for grain and other commodities, and workshops for basic craft production, including textile manufacture, metal working, and pottery production. The agricultural techniques employed by Saxon farmers demonstrated sophisticated adaptation to local environmental conditions with crop rotation systems, selective breeding of livestock, and careful management of woodland resources that maximize productivity while maintaining long-term sustainability. Saxon farmers cultivated a variety of crops including wheat, barley, oats, and rye, with different grains selected for specific soil conditions and climatic factors. The presence of specialized agricultural tools, including iron-tipped plows, scythes, and harvesting equipment, indicates technological sophistication that enhance productivity while reducing labor requirements. Animal husbandry played an equally important role, with cattle providing milk, meat, and leather, while pigs, sheep, and chickens supplied additional protein sources and raw materials for textile production. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the ethnic slaves, whose status derived from capture in warfare, debt bondage, or birth into servile families. These individuals possess no legal rights and could be bought, sold, or transferred as property. Though their treatment varied considerably depending on their skills, the wealth of their owners, and local customs that might provide some protection against the worst forms of abuse. Skilled slaves who possessed valuable crafts, knowledge, or administrative abilities often enjoyed relatively comfortable conditions and might eventually earn or purchase their freedom. While agricultural slaves typically endured harsh working conditions with minimal provisions for their welfare. The archaeological record provides limited direct evidence for slave conditions, though the presence of simple burials without grave goods in areas adjacent to high-status settlements suggests the existence of substantial servile populations. The economic foundations of Saxon society rested upon agricultural production that generated sufficient surplus to support specialized craft production, long-distance trade, and the maintenance of non-productive social groups, including warriors, priests, and administrators. The typical Saxon village included not only farmers, but also specialized craftsmen who produced the tools, weapons, textiles, and other goods necessary for daily life. Blacksmiths held particularly important positions within these communities, as their skills were essential for producing and maintaining the iron tools and weapons upon which Saxon society depended. Archaeological evidence from Saxons and settlements reveals sophisticated metalworking techniques, including pattern welding for sword production, advanced techniques for producing agricultural tools, and the manufacture of decorative objects that combined functional utility with artistic expression. Textile production represented another crucial economic activity that involved virtually every household in Saxon society, with women playing central roles in spinning, weaving, and dyeing the wool and linen fabrics that clothed Saxon populations. The presence of loom weights, spindle whorls, and other textile-related artifacts in Saxon archaeological sites demonstrates the importance of cloth production in daily economic life. High-quality textiles serve not only practical purposes, but also social and political functions with elaborate clothing and decorative fabrics, serving as markers of social status and wealth. The production of luxury textiles for elite consumption required specialized skills and expensive materials, including imported silk threads and exotic dyes that connected Saxon communities to long-distance trade networks. The development of burrs, fortified towns that combined defensive capabilities with commercial and administrative functions represented a significant innovation in Saxon settlement patterns that reflected both military necessities and economic opportunities. These fortified centers typically featured substantial earthwork defenses surrounding areas that included residential quarters, craft workshops, storage facilities, and religious buildings. The layout of burhs demonstrates careful planning that maximized defensive advantages while facilitating internal economic activities and external trade relationships. Archaeological excavations at sites like Hamwick and Londonwick reveal the sophisticated urban planning that characterized major Saxon commercial centers with street layouts, drainage systems, and specialized districts for different types of economic activity. Trade networks connecting Saxon kingdoms extended across the North Sea to Scandinavia and continental Europe, while internal routes linked different regions of Anglo-Saxon England through river systems and established roadways that facilitated the movement of goods, people, and information. Saxon merchants traded a variety of commodities, including agricultural products, manufactured goods, raw materials, and luxury items that serve both practical needs and social display functions. The presence of foreign coins, imported pottery, and exotic materials in Saxon archaeological sites demonstrates the extent and sophistication of these commercial relationships. The cultural achievements of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during this period encompassed remarkable innovations in manuscript production, architectural design, and artistic expression that demonstrated both the resources available to successful kingdoms and their connections to broader European cultural developments. The development of distinctive Anglo-Saxon scripts, including the elegant, minuscule hands used for luxury manuscripts, facilitated the production of books that combined practical utility with aesthetic excellence. The monasteries of Northumbria, particularly Wearmouth Jarrow, under the leadership of Benedict Biscop, became major centers for manuscript production that created works of international significance. The architectural innovations of Anglo-Saxon church building reflected both practical needs and symbolic aspirations with structures that incorporated continental European design elements while adapting to local materials and construction techniques. The Church of St. Peter at Wearmouth, built under Benedict Biscop's direction, using stonemasons and glaziers brought from Gaul, established new standards for ecclesiastical architecture that influenced church construction throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The use of imported materials, including window glass, decorative stonework, and architectural sculpture, demonstrated the resources available to major monasteries, while creating buildings that served as symbols of Christian triumph and royal patronage. The development of Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions during this period created distinctive styles that combined Germanic decorative motifs with Christian iconography and classical influences drawn from continental European sources. The remarkable metal work found in royal burials demonstrates sophisticated techniques, including Cuisin enamel, filigree decoration, and pattern welding that required specialized knowledge and expensive materials. The production of elaborate jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial objects served not only aesthetic functions, but also political purposes, as the display of luxury goods reinforced royal authority while demonstrating the prosperity of successful kingdoms. The manuscript illumination traditions that developed in Anglo-Saxon monasteries created some of the most remarkable artistic achievements of early medieval Europe, combining Celtic decorative traditions with classical figural styles and innovative approaches to page layout and design. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced around 715 AD, demonstrates the sophisticated artistic capabilities of Anglo-Saxon scripturums while revealing the complex cultural influences that shaped religious art. The intricate interlace patterns, elaborate initial letters, and sophisticated use of color created visual experiences that enhanced the spiritual impact of sacred texts while demonstrating the technical skills and artistic vision of their creators. The economic foundation supporting these cultural achievements rested on agricultural innovations, craft specialization, and trade networks that generated the surplus resources necessary to support non-productive activities like manuscript production and monumental architecture. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing agricultural productivity during this period with new crops, improved tools, and more efficient land management techniques that supported growing populations while generating surplus production for trade and tribute. The development of specialized craft production centers created concentrations of skilled artisans whose products could be traded across long distances while serving local elite consumption needs. The social fabric of Saxon society rested upon a carefully structured hierarchy that permeated every aspect of daily existence, from the allocation of land and resources to the administration of justice and the conduct of religious ceremonies. At the apex of this system stood the king, whose authority derived not merely from military prowess, but from a complex web of ancestral legitimacy, divine sanction, and practical control over the distribution of wealth and land. Saxon kings maintained their position through the careful management of warrior retinues, the strategic allocation of royal estates, and the performance of ceremonial duties that reinforced their connection to both earthly power and supernatural authority. The royal household itself functioned as the administrative center of the kingdom, with specialized officials managing everything from the collection of tribute to the maintenance of royal weapons and the preparation of the elaborate feasts that demonstrated royal generosity and prosperity. Beneath the king in the social hierarchy stood the eorls, a noble class whose status derived from their ownership of substantial landed estates, their ability to maintain armed followers, and their participation in the royal council that advised the king on matters of war, law, and governance. These nobles typically controlled territories that included multiple villages and their surrounding agricultural lands, generating the resources necessary to support households that might include dozens of dependents, ranging from household warriors to specialized craftsmen. The eorls' estates served as local centers of authority where justice was administered, military service organized, and economic activities coordinated. Archaeological evidence from high-status Saxon settlements reveals the material culture associated with noble rank, including elaborate weapons, imported luxury goods, and substantial timber halls that could accommodate the large gatherings necessary for maintaining social and political relationships. The warrior retinues that surrounded Saxon kings and nobles represented one of the most distinctive features of Saxon political organization, creating bonds of personal loyalty that transcended traditional kinship ties while providing the military foundation for royal authority. These comitatus groups typically consisted of young men who had sworn personal oaths to their lord, binding themselves through sacred ceremonies that involved the exchange of weapons, rings, and other symbols of mutual obligation. The warriors received not only weapons and equipment from their lord, but also regular gifts of gold, silver, and other valuables that demonstrated their status, while creating ongoing obligations for continued service. The relationship between lord and warrior was reciprocal, with the lord providing protection, sustenance, and opportunities for glory in exchange for absolute loyalty and military service that could extend to death in battle. The institution of the comitus created a military aristocracy that was both highly effective in warfare and deeply integrated into Saxon political and social structures. The Sutton whose ship burial represents perhaps the most spectacular archaeological evidence for the wealth and international connections of early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with grave goods that demonstrate trade relationships extending from Scandinavia to the eastern Mediterranean. The burial chamber contained a remarkable assemblage of objects, including a Swedish helmet, Frankish coins, Byzantine silver, and locally produced jewelry that reveals the complex networks of exchange and diplomacy that connected Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the broader European world. The ship itself, over 90 feet in length and capable of carrying a crew of 40 oarsmen, demonstrates the continued importance of maritime connections in Anglo-Saxon political and economic life. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England began with Augustine's mission to Kent in 597 AD, an initiative sponsored by Pope Gregory the Great that represented the first systematic attempt to convert the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms since their establishment in Britain. Augustine's arrival at the court of a Filbert created a crucial precedent for the relationship between royal authority and religious conversion, as the king's acceptance of Christianity provided legitimacy and protection for missionary activities while creating new sources of royal authority based on divine sanction. The establishment of the Archbishopric of Canterbury provided an institutional framework for ongoing Christian development, while maintaining connections with Rome that brought Anglo-Saxon England into the broader community of European Christendom. The Roman mission's approach to conversion emphasized the adaptation of existing religious sites and practices rather than their complete destruction, a pragmatic strategy that facilitated acceptance of Christianity while preserving elements of traditional culture that could be incorporated into Christian frameworks. Archaeological evidence from converted pagan temple sites reveals the construction of Christian churches on locations that have been sacred for centuries, with building materials and architectural elements from earlier structures incorporated into new Christian buildings. This continuity of sacred space helped ease the transition from paganism to Christianity while providing familiar focal points for religious devotion. The Celtic Christian tradition established in northern and western Britain through the missionary activities of figures like Columba and Aidin represented an alternative approach to Christianization that emphasized monastic communities' ascetic practices and distinctive liturgical traditions that had developed in relative isolation from continental European Christianity. The monastery of Iona, founded by Columba in 563 AD, became a major center for missionary activity that extended Celtic Christian influence throughout Scotland and northern England. The distinctive artistic traditions associated with Celtic Christianity, including elaborate manuscript, illumination, and sculptural decoration, created cultural expressions that would profoundly influence Anglo-Saxon artistic development. The encounter between Roman and Celtic Christian traditions in Anglo-Saxon England created tensions that extended beyond simple theological differences to encompass questions of ecclesiastical authority, liturgical practice, and cultural identity. The most visible manifestation of these differences involved the calculation of Easter, with Roman and Celtic churches following different systems that resulted in the celebration of Christianity's most important feast on different dates. The practical implications of this disagreement extended to questions of monastic tour, baptismal practices, and episcopal authority that affected the daily lives of Christian communities throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The Synod of Whitby in 664 AD represented the crucial moment when these competing Christian traditions were forced to confront their differences and establish unified practices for the Northumbrian Church. King Oswic of Northumbria presided over debates between representatives of both traditions, with Wilfrid arguing for Roman practices and Colman defending Celtic traditions. The king's decision to adopt Roman practices established a precedent that would influence Christian development throughout Anglo-Saxon England, while demonstrating the crucial role of royal authority in determining religious policy. The synod's outcome represented not simply a theological victory, but a political decision that aligned Anglo-Saxon Christianity with continental European practices and institutions. The aftermath of the Synod of Whitby saw the gradual standardization of Christian practices throughout Anglo-Saxon England, with Celtic monasteries either adopting Roman customs or losing their influence to newly established institutions that followed continental models. The departure of Colman and other Celtic clergy who refused to accept the synod's decisions created opportunities for the appointment of new ecclesiastical leaders trained in Roman traditions and committed to implementing standardized practices. This transition facilitated the development of more systematic approaches to Christian education, missionary activity, and ecclesiastical administration that would characterize Anglo-Saxon Christianity for centuries. The development of Anglo-Saxon law codes during this period reflected the gradual integration of Christian moral principles with traditional Germanic legal practices, creating hybrid systems that addressed the needs of increasingly complex societies while maintaining continuity with ancestral traditions. The laws of Ina of Wessex, promulgated around 690 AD, demonstrate sophisticated approaches to regulating Christian behavior while preserving essential elements of Anglo-Saxon social organization. These codes addressed issues ranging from marriage and inheritance to criminal penalties and ecclesiastical privileges, creating comprehensive legal frameworks that could govern diverse populations with different cultural backgrounds and religious commitments. The ecclesiastical provisions in Anglo-Saxon law codes reveal the growing influence of Christian institutions in secular governance, with churches and monasteries receiving legal protections and privileges that enhance their ability to accumulate property and influence political decisions. The requirement that kings consult with ecclesiastical authorities on important matters created new sources of royal legitimacy, while providing Christian institutions with opportunities to shape political policy. The development of sanctuary rights, clerical immunity from secular prosecution, and ecclesiastical courts created parallel legal systems that competed with traditional Anglo-Saxon judicial institutions. The period from 600 to 800 AD witnessed the crystallization of what later chroniclers would term the Heptarchy. 7 major kingdoms that dominated Anglo-Saxon England through shifting alliances, territorial conquests, and the gradual accumulation of resources that allowed successful rulers to project power far beyond their original tribal boundaries. These kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and East Anglia, each developed distinctive political institutions, cultural characteristics, and territorial ambitions that would shape the course of English history for centuries to come. The Kingdom of Kent emerged as the first truly sophisticated Anglo-Saxon political entity under the leadership of Ethelbert, whose reign from approximately 560 to 616 AD established many of the institutional foundations that other kingdoms would later adopt and adapt to their own circumstances. Archaeological evidence from Canterbury and other Kentish sites reveals the development of specialized craft production centers, the construction of substantial royal halls, and the accumulation of luxury goods that indicate both the economic prosperity and the political stability necessary to support elaborate court culture. Ethelbert's marriage to Bertha, a Frankish princess and Christian, created diplomatic connections with continental Europe that brought Kent into the broader network of relationships connecting the emerging kingdoms of post-Roman Western Europe. The Kentish royal court under Ethelbert attracted merchants, craftsmen, and scholars from across the known world, creating a cosmopolitan environment that facilitated cultural exchange and technological innovation. Archaeological excavations at royal sites have uncovered evidence for sophisticated metalworking, including the production of elaborate jewelry and weapons that combined Anglo-Saxon artistic traditions with techniques and motifs borrowed from Frankish, Byzantine, and even Mediterranean sources. The presence of imported goods, including wine, silk, and precious stones, indicates trade relationships that extended across Europe and into the Eastern Mediterranean, demonstrating the resources and connections available to successful Anglo-Saxon rulers. The development of written law codes under Ethelbert marked a crucial innovation in Anglo-Saxon governance, as traditional oral legal traditions were codified into systematic written documents that could be applied consistently across territorial boundaries and social groups. The laws of Ethel, preserved in manuscripts from later centuries, reveal sophisticated legal concepts, including graduated penalties for different classes of victims, detailed provisions for property rights, and complex procedures for resolving disputes between individuals of a different social status. These legal innovations provided mechanisms for governing ethnically diverse populations that included not only Anglo-Saxon settlers, but also Romano-British inhabitants and foreign merchants who required predictable legal frameworks to conduct their activities safely. Mercuria's rise to prominence during the 7th and 8th centuries demonstrated the potential for inland kingdoms to achieve dominance through aggressive territorial expansion and sophisticated military organization. Under kings like Penda and his successors, Mercia expanded from its original territories in the upper Trent Valley to control vast areas of central England, creating a kingdom that stretched from the Welsh borders to the North Sea and from the Thames Valley northward into Yorkshire. This expansion required not only military success, but also administrative innovations that could integrate conquered territories and populations into a coherent political system capable of mobilizing resources for further campaigns. The Meon military system under Penda and his successors represented a significant evolution from the warband structures of earlier periods, incorporating elements that would later influence medieval military organization throughout Europe. Archaeological evidence from Mercian royal sites reveals the existence of specialized weapon production centers capable of equipping large armies with standardized equipment, while burial evidence suggests the development of a military aristocracy bound to the king through elaborate systems of reciprocal obligation. The presence of substantial earthwork fortifications at sites like Tamworth indicates the resources available to Mercian rulers and their ability to coordinate large-scale construction projects that required the mobilization of thousands of workers. Northumbria's emergence as a major power combined the military traditions of two originally separate kingdoms, Benicia and Dara, whose union under Edwin and his successors created the largest and most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom of the 7th century. The Northumbrian kingdom at its height controlled territories extending from the Humber northward to the Forth, encompassing not only Anglo-Saxon settlements, but also substantial British and Pictish populations who retained their own cultural traditions while acknowledging Northumbrian political supremacy. This ethnic diversity required sophisticated governmental approaches that could accommodate different legal traditions, religious practices, and social organizations within a single political framework. The concept of Bretwald, or Briton ruler, emerged during this period as successful kings sought to extend their authority beyond their own territorial boundaries to exercise overlordship over neighboring kingdoms. Bede's list of rulers who held this position reveals the shifting balance of power between the major kingdoms, with supremacy passing from Kent to Sussex to Wessex to East Anglia to Northumbria, and finally to Mercia, as different kingdoms achieved temporary dominance through military success, diplomatic skill, or economic resources. The Bretwalder concept represented more than simple military conquest, encompassing tribute relationships, marriage alliances, and religious patronage that created networks of obligation and influence extending across Anglo-Saxon England. The political dynamics underlying Bretwalder status involved complex calculations of military capability, economic resources, and diplomatic relationships that required successful rulers to maintain delicate balances between cooperation and competition with their royal peers. Archaeological evidence from royal sites reveals the material culture associated with overlordship, including elaborate weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that serve both practical and symbolic functions in maintaining royal authority. The famous Sutton Hoo burial complex provides remarkable insight into the resources available to East Anglian rulers during their period of prominence, with grave goods that include weapons, jewelry, and ceremonial objects drawn from across the known world. The requirement that all Saxons pay church tithes imposed a financial burden that supported the very institution responsible for destroying their traditional culture. The mass deportations that accompanied the implementation of the capitulatio represented perhaps the most brutal aspect of Charlemagne's Saxon policy, as entire communities were forcibly relocated to distant parts of the Frankish Empire, where they could be more easily controlled and converted. Archaeological evidence from abandoned Saxon settlements reveals the sudden cessation of occupation at sites that have been continuously inhabited for centuries, with household goods and agricultural tools left behind by populations who had no opportunity to prepare for their forced departure. These deportations disrupted family networks, destroyed local knowledge systems, and eliminated the cultural continuity that sustained Saxon resistance. The replacement of deported Saxon populations with Frankish colonists created new demographic patterns that fundamentally altered the character of Saxon territories. These colonists brought different agricultural techniques, settlement patterns, and social organizations that gradually transformed the landscape in ways that made it increasingly difficult for surviving Saxon populations to maintain their traditional way of life. The establishment of Frankish churches, monasteries, and administrative centers in former Saxon territories created new focal points of authority and cultural influence that competed with and ultimately replaced traditional Saxon institutions. The executions at Verdun in 782 mark the most notorious episode of Charlemagne's Saxon Wars, when approximately 4,500 Saxon prisoners were beheaded in a single day following their surrender after the Battle of the Sunil Mountains. This mass execution shocked contemporary observers and created lasting resentment among Saxon populations who had previously viewed warfare as a limited activity governed by traditional rules of conduct. The scale of the killings went far beyond anything in previous Germanic warfare, representing a fundamental shift toward total war that aimed at the complete destruction of Saxon resistance rather than traditional objectives like tribute or territorial concessions. The immediate aftermath of the Verdun executions revealed the counterproductive nature of Charlemagne's extreme measures, as Saxon populations who had been considering submission were instead driven to renewed resistance by the demonstration of Frankish brutality. Widukind, who'd been negotiating potential surrender terms, resumed active military operations with increased support from Saxon populations, who now understood that submission offered no guarantee of survival. The executions also damaged Charlemagne's reputation among other Germanic peoples who began to question whether the Frankish promises of fair treatment could be trusted. The renewed Saxon uprising that followed the Verdun executions demonstrated the continued vitality of Saxon military organization. Despite years of warfare and systematic oppression, Saxon forces launched coordinated attacks across multiple fronts, temporarily driving Frankish garrisons from large areas of conquered territory and destroying many of the churches and administrative centers that had been established to consolidate Frankish control. The sophistication of these operations, involving simultaneous attacks separated by hundreds of miles, revealed the existence of communication networks and command structures that had survived despite Frankish efforts to destroy Saxon political organization. The gradual exhaustion of Saxon resistance during the final phase of the wars reflected not military defeat, but the cumulative impact of decades of warfare, deportation, and cultural destruction that had undermined the foundations of Saxon society. Archaeological evidence from Saxon settlements shows declining population levels, reduced craft production, and increasing reliance on Frankish trade goods that indicate growing dependence on the very system that Saxon resistance sought to oppose. The death or exile of traditional leadership, the destruction of religious sites, and the disruption of agricultural cycles created cascading effects that made sustained resistance increasingly difficult to maintain. Widukind's eventual submission and baptism in 785 symbolized the end of organized Saxon resistance. Though the ceremony itself revealed the pragmatic calculations that motivated this decision rather than genuine religious conversion. Contemporary accounts describe the baptism as a carefully negotiated political arrangement that guaranteed Widukind's personal safety and allowed him to retain limited authority over his followers in exchange for acknowledging Frankish supremacy and accepting Christian conversion. The terms of this agreement suggest that, even in defeat, Saxon leaders retained sufficient bargaining power to negotiate conditions for their submission rather than accepting unconditional surrender. The integration of Saxon territories into the Carolingian Empire required fundamental changes in administrative, legal, and religious structures that gradually transformed the character of Saxon society. The establishment of bishoprics at Bremen and other Saxon centers created new sources of authority and cultural influence that competed with traditional Saxon institutions while providing mechanisms for ongoing supervision of the converted population. These ecclesiastical establishments served not only religious functions, but also administrative and educational roles that gradually created new forms of Saxon identity compatible with Frankish imperial objectives. The long-term consequences of Charlemagne's Saxon wars extended far beyond the immediate military and political objectives to encompass fundamental changes in the demographic, cultural, and religious landscape of Northern Europe. The destruction of Saxon paganism eliminated the last major non-Christian religious system in Western Europe, while the integration of Saxon territories into the Carolingian Empire created new patterns of trade, communication, and cultural exchange that would influence European development for centuries. The survival of Saxon legal traditions within the broader framework of Carolingian law preserved important elements of Germanic legal culture, while adapting them to Christian and imperial requirements. The emergence of consolidated Anglo-Saxon kingdoms from the scattered settlements and war bands of the previous century represented a fundamental transformation in the political landscape of early medieval Britain as tribal confederations gave way to sophisticated territorial monarchies capable of sustained military campaigns, complex diplomatic relationships, and elaborate administrative systems. The initial Frankish probes into Saxon territory during the 760s revealed both the military capabilities of Saxon warriors and the challenges posed by their guerrilla tactics. Saxon forces typically avoided pitched battles against the heavily armored Frankish cavalry, instead employing hit-and-run attacks that maximize their knowledge of local terrain while minimizing their exposure to superior Frankish military technology. Saxon warriors were skilled in forest warfare, using the dense woodlands that covered much of their territory to launch surprise attacks against Frankish supply trains and isolated garrisons before melting away into familiar landscapes where pursuit was nearly impossible. Their intimate knowledge of river crossings, hidden paths, and defensible positions gave them significant tactical advantages that offset Frankish superiority in equipment and formal military training. Charlemagne's decision to launch a systematic conquest of Saxony in 772 represented a fundamental shift from the limited border raids and defensive campaigns that had characterized previous Frankish-Saxon interactions. The king assembled a substantial army that included not only his elite cavalry, but also infantry forces capable of siege warfare and engineers equipped with the tools necessary to reduce Saxon fortifications. The campaign began with a direct assault on Eresburg, the fortified site that protected the Mansell Sanctuary, demonstrating Charlemagne's understanding the successful conquest required the destruction of Saxon religious as well as political resistance. The capture and destruction of the Mansell sent shock waves throughout Saxon society as the failure of their supreme deity to protect his most sacred shrine called into question the supernatural foundations of Saxon resistance. The Frankish army that crossed into Saxon territory in 772 represented the most sophisticated military machine in Western Europe, with tactical innovations that had been developed through decades of successful campaigns against Lombards, Bavarians, and other enemies. Charlemagne's heavy cavalry formed the core of his striking force, with warriors mounted on specially bred war horses and equipped with long spears, swords, and protective armor that made them nearly invulnerable to Saxon infantry attacks in open terrain. These mounted warriors were supported by infantry forces that included both Frankish levies and allied troops from recently conquered territories. creating a combined arms force capable of adapting to different tactical situations and terrain conditions. The destruction of the German soul marked the beginning of a systematic campaign to eliminate Saxon religious infrastructure and replace it with Christian institutions. Frankish forces targeted sacred groves, springs, and other cult sites throughout Saxon territory, often constructing churches or monasteries on the same locations to demonstrate the triumph of Christianity over paganism. This religious warfare created profound psychological pressure on Saxon populations as the apparent inability of their traditional gods to protect sacred sites undermined confidence in the supernatural support that had sustained their resistance. The replacement of familiar religious landmarks with our alien Christian structures served as constant reminders of defeat and foreign domination that penetrated deeply into Saxon consciousness. Widukind of Westphalia emerged as the most significant leader of Saxon resistance during the early phases of Charlemagne's conquest, demonstrating the military and political skills necessary to coordinate opposition across the traditional tribal divisions. Archaeological evidence from Westphalian site suggests that Widukind commanded resources and authority that extended well beyond his immediate tribal territory, with weapon deposits of fortification, works indicating coordinated defensive preparations involving multiple Saxon groups. His ability to maintain organized resistance for over a decade despite repeated military defeats testifies to both his personal charisma and the depth of Saxon opposition to Frankish domination. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed under Widukind's leadership proved remarkably effective against Frankish conventional forces, forcing Charlemagne to adapt his military strategies to counter an enemy who refused to engage in the type of decisive battles that had brought victory in other campaigns. Saxon warbands struck at Frankish supply lines, isolated garrisons, and newly established Christian settlements with devastating effect, often coordinating simultaneous attacks across wide geographical areas that prevented effective Frankish response. These operations required sophisticated intelligence networks and communication systems that demonstrated the continued vitality of Saxon political organization. Despite the destruction of formal governmental structures, the establishment of Frankish administrative control over conquered Saxon territories proved far more difficult than the initial military conquest, as Saxon populations employed passive resistance and periodic rebellion to undermine Frankish authority. Charlemagne's attempts to govern through appointed counts and other Frankish officials met with limited success, as these administrators lacked the local knowledge and cultural understanding necessary to maintain order among a hostile population. The constant threat of Saxon uprising required the maintenance of substantial military garrisons that drained Frankish resources while providing targets for renewed Saxon attacks. The Capitulio de Artibus Saxoni, promulgated around 785, represented Charlemagne's most systematic attempt to transform Saxon society through legal coercion and religious conversion. This comprehensive legal code imposed Christianity on all Saxon populations while prescribing death penalties for a wide range of traditional practices, including pagan worship, cremation of the dead, and refusal to accept baptism. The document reveals the extent to which Charlemagne recognized that military conquest alone could not achieve lasting control over Saxon territories, as sustainable domination required fundamental changes in Saxon cultural identity and social organization. The legal provisions of the Capitulatio demonstrate the comprehensive nature of Charlemagne's assault on Saxon culture, extending far beyond simple religious conversion to encompass virtually every aspect of traditional life. The code prohibited Saxon assemblies unless authorized by Frankish officials, effectively destroying the democratic institutions that had governed Saxon society for centuries. Traditional legal practices, including trial by ordeal and compensation payments for crimes, were replaced with Frankish legal procedures that Saxon populations neither understood nor accepted as legitimate. The presence of substantial weapon deposits and Sussex burials indicates the continued importance of warrior culture in South Saxon society. While the distribution of high-status settlements suggests territorial organization based on military control rather than administrative efficiency, Essex presents yet another model of Saxon kingdom development with evidence for closer integration with existing Romano-British administrative and economic structures. The East Saxon kings appear to have inherited and adapted Roman territorial divisions, maintaining urban centers like London as a commercial and administrative hubs while establishing Saxon control over surrounding agricultural areas. The material culture from Essex shows remarkable continuity with Romano-British traditions in areas like pottery production and building techniques, suggesting a process of cultural synthesis rather than wholesale replacement. The gradual displacement and assimilation of Celtic and Romano-British populations follow different patterns in various regions influenced by factors including population density, economic resources, and the strength of local resistance. In areas like Kent and Sussex, where Saxon settlement was most intensive, archaeological evidence suggests significant demographic change, with Romano-British material culture largely replaced by Saxon traditions within a few generations. However, even in these areas, certain elements of British culture persisted, particularly in agricultural techniques, place names, and religious practices that would later influence Saxon development. The Thames Valley presents a more complex picture of population interaction with evidence for sustained coexistence between Saxon and British communities throughout the 6th century. Archaeological investigations reveal settlements where Saxon and British material cultures appear side by side, suggesting either peaceful coexistence or gradual cultural assimilation rather than violent displacement. The presence of mixed burial assemblages containing both Saxon and British grave goods indicates intermarriage and cultural exchange that created hybrid identities combining elements from both traditions. The linguistic evidence for Saxon-British interaction reveals the extent to which existing populations influence Saxon development, even in areas of intensive Germanic settlement. The survival of British river names, topographical features, and settlement names throughout Saxon territories indicates the continued presence of British populations who serve as sources of local knowledge and cultural continuity. The adoption of British agricultural techniques and land management practices by Saxon settlers demonstrates practical adaptation to local environmental conditions that required cooperation with existing populations. The religious landscape during the Saxon settlement period reflects the complex interaction between Germanic paganism, Romano-British Christianity, and Celtic religious traditions. Archaeological evidence from Saxon cemeteries reveals burial practices that combine continental Germanic traditions with local adaptations, including the occasional presence of Christian symbols alongside traditional pagan grave goods. The persistence of Romano-British churches and religious sites in areas of Saxon settlement suggests either tolerance for existing religious practices or gradual conversion processes that preserved elements of earlier traditions. The economic transformation of Britain during the Saxon settlement period involved fundamental changes in trade networks, craft production, and agricultural organization. The collapse of Roman commercial systems created opportunities for new economic arrangements based on Saxon connections with continental markets and different approaches to resource exploitation. Archaeological evidence reveals the development of specialized craft production centers that served regional markets while maintaining connections with continental suppliers and customers. The presence of continental imports in Saxons and settlements indicates the maintenance of North Sea trade networks that provided access to luxury goods, raw materials, and technological innovations. While their kinsmen across the North Sea were establishing kingdoms in post-Roman Britain, the Saxon tribes who remained in their ancestral homeland along the Weser and Ella rivers found themselves facing an entirely different existential challenge. The rise of Frankish power under the Carolingian dynasty brought systematic pressure against the last major pagan stronghold in Western Europe. As Charlemagne's armies began probing Saxon territories with increasing frequency and determination, the continental Saxons had maintained their traditional confederation structure. Their ancient religious practices and their fierce independence for centuries, while Rome fell and new Christian kingdoms emerged around them. Their decentralized political organization, which had served them well against earlier threats, would prove both a strength and a fatal weakness in the face of Charlemagne's methodical approach to conquest and conversion. The Saxon territories that Charlemagne inherited as his primary target stretched across the North German plain from the Rhine eastward to the Elbe, encompassing the river valleys of the Ems, Weser, and their numerous tributaries. This vast region supported a population estimated at several hundred people organized into three primary tribal divisions. The Phalians occupying the lands between the Rhine and Weser. The Angrians settled along the middle of Zaw Valley and extending northward toward the coast, and the East Phalians controlling territories from the Weser to the Elbe and southward into the Harz Mountains. Each division maintained its own assembly of nobles and free men, its own military organization, and its own sacred sites, creating a complex political landscape that lacked the centralized authority structures that had made other Germanic peoples easier targets for Frankish expansion. The religious significance of Saxon resistance cannot be understated, as their territories contain some of the most important pagan cult sites in Northern Europe. The Mansel, a massive wooden pillar or tree trunk that served as the axis connecting Earth to the heavens in Saxon cosmology, stood at Eresburg in Westphalian territory and drew pilgrims from across the Germanic world. Archaeological evidence suggests this site had been sacred for centuries, with ritual deposits and votive offerings indicating continuous religious activity that reinforced Saxon identity and provided supernatural sanction for resistance against Christian invaders. The destruction of such sites would become a primary objective in Charlemagne's campaign, as he recognized that military conquest alone could not achieve lasting control over a population whose identity was so thoroughly intertwined with their traditional religious practices. The distribution of these settlements indicates systematic division of territory, with individual communities spaced at regular intervals that maximized agricultural potential while providing mutual support in case of external threats. The presence of high-status burials containing imported goods and elaborate weapon sets suggests the establishment of local aristocratic hierarchies that could coordinate activities across multiple settlements. The expansion of Saxon settlement beyond Kent into Sussex, Essex, and the Thames Valley followed similar patterns of strategic positioning and gradual territorial consolidation. In Sussex, archaeological evidence from sites like Bishopstone and Rookery Hill reveals Saxon communities established along river valleys that provided access to both inland agricultural areas and coastal resources. The settlers demonstrated remarkable adaptability, modifying continental building techniques to accommodate local materials and environmental conditions while maintaining essential cultural practices. The presence of specialized craft workshops in these settlements indicates economic diversification beyond simple subsistence agriculture, with evidence for metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacture. The establishment of Wessex represents perhaps the most significant example of Saxon territorial expansion during this period, with archaeological evidence suggesting systematic colonization of the Thames Valley and surrounding regions beginning in the late 5th century. Sites like Dorchester on Thames reveal substantial Saxons and settlements with complex internal organization, including residential areas, craft workshops, and ceremonial spaces. The material culture from these sites demonstrates continued contact with continental Saxon territories while developing distinctive local characteristics that would later define West Saxon identity. The presence of weapon burials containing high-quality spears, shields, and occasional swords indicates the maintenance of warrior culture, even as communities developed agricultural and craft-based economies. Essex presents a somewhat different pattern of Saxon settlement, with evidence suggesting closer integration with existing Romano-British populations and administrative structures. Archaeological investigations at sites, like miking, reveal mixed material assemblages that combine Saxon pottery and metalwork with Romano-British building techniques and settlement layouts. This pattern suggests a process of gradual cultural transformation rather than wholesale population replacement, with Saxon elites assuming control over existing territorial and administrative frameworks while allowing continuity in local practices and population. The resistance mounted by Romano-British populations against Saxon expansion varied considerably across different regions and time periods, ranging from organized military campaigns to local defensive arrangements and diplomatic negotiations. The historical figure of Ambrosius Aurelianes emerges from contemporary sources as a significant British leader who organized effective resistance against Saxon territorial expansion during the late 5th century. Gildas describes Ambrosia as a Roman-educated aristocrat who rallied British forces and achieved notable military successes against Saxon warbands, temporarily halting their westward expansion and establishing a period of relative stability that lasted for several decades. The military campaigns associated with Ambrosia Aurelianes reveal the sophisticated defensive capabilities that Romano-British populations could mobilize when properly organized and led. Archaeological evidence from hill forts across western Britain shows extensive refortification during the late 5th and early 6th centuries, with new defensive works constructed using both Roman engineering techniques and adaptations suited to contemporary military threats. Sites like Cadbury Castle in Somerset reveal massive defensive earthworks and evidence for substantial garrison forces, suggesting coordinated defensive strategies that could effectively challenge Saxon military superiority. The Arthurian legends, while heavily mythologized in later medieval literature, appear to preserve genuine historical memories of British resistance to Saxon expansion during this crucial period. The core narrative of a British war leader who achieved significant military victories against Saxon forces align with contemporary evidence for effective Romano-British resistance during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Archaeological investigations at sites traditionally associated with Arthur, such as Tincherill and Glastonbury, have revealed evidence for high-status occupation during the appropriate time period, including imported Mediterranean pottery and luxury goods that suggest contact with continental trade networks and the resources necessary to support major military campaigns. The Battle of Ben Hill, mentioned by Gildas as a decisive British victory that halted Saxon expansion for a generation, represents the culmination of organized Romano-British resistance during this period. While the exact location and date of this engagement remain disputed, the historical impact, described by contemporary sources, suggests a significant military defeat that forced Saxon groups to consolidate their existing territories rather than continue aggressive expansion. Archaeological evidence from Saxon settlements shows a marked change in material culture during the early 6th century, with reduced evidence for new territorial expansion and increased emphasis on internal development and agricultural intensification. The establishment of early Saxon kingdoms during the 6th century represented a fundamental transformation from the tribal confederation structures that had characterized continental Saxon society. The kingdoms of Kent, Sussex, Essex, and Wessex each developed distinctive political institutions that combined Germanic traditions with adaptations to local British conditions and populations. Kent, under the leadership of kings like Ethelbert, established sophisticated legal codes and administrative structures that governed both Saxon and British populations within their territories. The Kentish royal court attracted continental merchants and craftsmen, creating a cosmopolitan environment that facilitated cultural exchange and economic development. The Kingdom of Sussex developed along somewhat different lines, with archaeological evidence suggesting a more militarized society focused on territorial defense and expansion. The South Saxon kings maintained closer connections with continental Saxon territories, as evidenced by material culture that shows continued importation of Germanic goods and artistic styles. Saxon naval operations against Gaul demonstrated the same systematic approach evident in their attacks on Britain, with raiders targeting river valleys that provided access to wealthy interior settlements. The Sun, Loire, and other major rivers became highways for Saxon penetration deep into Roman territory, with their shallow draft vessels capable of navigating far upstream to reach previously secure areas. Roman sources describe Saxon fleets ascending rivers for hundreds of miles, establishing temporary bases from which they could conduct extended raiding campaigns before withdrawing to the safety of the open sea. The sophistication of Saxon piracy is evident in their development of specialized tactics for different types of targets and defensive situations. Coastal raids typically employed surprise attacks at dawn or dusk, when visibility was poor and defenders were least prepared. River operations required different approaches, with scouts sent ahead to identify obstacles and defensive positions, while the main force prepared for potential fighting withdrawals if confronted by superior numbers. The raiders demonstrated remarkable adaptability, modifying their tactics based on local conditions and the responses of their opponents. The economic impact of Saxon piracy extended far beyond the immediate losses from individual raids to include broader disruption of trade networks and coastal settlement patterns. Roman merchants increasingly avoided routes known to be frequented by Saxon raiders, leading to the decline of previously prosperous ports and the development of alternative inland routes that were more expensive and less efficient. Coastal villa estates, once symbols of Roman prosperity and security, were abandoned or fortified as their owners sought safety in more defensible locations. The cumulative effect was a significant reduction in the economic vitality of coastal regions and a shift in population and resources away from the sea. The response of local populations to Saxon raiding varied considerably, depending on their resources and strategic situation. Some communities attempted to negotiate protection arrangements, offering tribute or supplies in exchange for immunity from attack. Others organized local militias and constructed fortifications, though these were rarely effective against determined Saxon assault. The most successful defensive measures typically involve coordination between multiple communities and integration with Roman military forces. Though such cooperation was often difficult to achieve given the competing interests and limited resources of local authorities. Saxon settlement patterns during the migration period reflect the dual nature of their activities, combining continued occupation of traditional territories with the establishment of new bases in conquered or allied territories. Archaeological evidence suggests that core areas in Holstein and Westphalia remained occupied throughout the migration period, serving as sources of reinforcement and supply for overseas operations. Simultaneously, Saxon groups established permanent settlements in Britain, northern Gaul, and other regions where successful raiding had revealed opportunities for colonization. The transformation of Saxon society during the migration period involved fundamental changes in social organization and cultural identity that would have lasting consequences for their subsequent development. The traditional confederation structure gave way to more centralized leadership under successful war leaders, while the importance of maritime capabilities elevated the status of shipbuilders, navigators, and other specialists essential to naval operations. The accumulation of wealth from raiding and the establishment of new territories created opportunities for social advancement that disrupted traditional hierarchies while reinforcing the importance of military prowess as the primary path to status and power. The systematic Saxon colonization of Britain emerged from the convergence of Roman imperial weakness, internal British political fragmentation, and the accumulated maritime expertise that Saxon warbands had developed through generations of raiding and mercenary service. By the mid-5th century, the withdrawal of Roman legions had left Britain's Romano-British elite struggling to maintain control over territories that had depended on imperial military support for nearly 4 centuries. The collapse of centralized Roman administration created a power vacuum that local British kings attempted to fill through a combination of diplomatic alliances, military recruitment, and territorial consolidation. It was within this context of political instability and military necessity that British rulers first invited Saxon warriors to serve as foederati, a decision that would fundamentally alter the demographic, cultural, and political landscape of post-Roman Britain. The traditional account of Hennist and Horsa's arrival in 449 AD, preserved primarily in Bede's ecclesiastical history, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes their invitation by the British King Vortigern as a response to mounting pressure from Pictish and Scottish raids in the north. According to these sources, Vortigern granted the Saxon brothers territory in Kent in exchange for military service, providing them with 3 ships' worth of warriors who would serve as a buffer against northern threats. The narrative presents this arrangement as a calculated political decision that initially benefited both parties, with the Saxons receiving land and provisions while the British gained experienced Germanic warriors familiar with the military techniques of their enemies. Archaeological evidence from Kent supports the presence of significant Germanic settlement beginning in the mid-5th century. Though the material record suggests a more complex process than the traditional narrative implies, excavations at sites like Myking and Westow reveal substantial Saxon communities established during this period, with settlement patterns indicating planned colonization rather than temporary military encampments. The pottery assemblages from these sites show clear continuity with continental Saxon traditions while incorporating local British elements, suggesting sustained contact with homeland territories and gradual adaptation to local conditions. Burial evidence from cemeteries like Fingalsam and Sar demonstrates the establishment of complete communities, including women, children, and craftsmen, indicating permanent settlement rather than purely military occupation. The settlement patterns in Kent reveal sophisticated territorial organization that suggests coordinated planning rather than random occupation. Saxon communities typically establish themselves on elevated ground near river valleys, taking advantage of natural defensive positions while maintaining access to transportation routes and agricultural land. The development of Saxon naval warfare capabilities during this period represented a revolutionary adaptation that transformed them from coastal raiders into a major maritime threat throughout the North Sea region. The vessels evolved from simple coastal craft into sophisticated warships, capable of extended operations far from home waters. Archaeological reconstructions based on ship finds from Needham and other sites reveal sleek, shallow draft vessels measuring up to 75 feet in length, powered by crews of 30 to 40 oarsmen and capable of carrying substantial numbers of warriors along with their equipment. These ships featured flexible construction techniques that allowed them to flex with ocean swells while maintaining structural integrity, making them ideal for both river navigation and open sea voyages. Saxon piracy against Roman Britain emerged as a systematic enterprise rather than random raiding, with organized fleets conducting coordinated attacks against Pacific targets along the British coast. Roman sources describe Saxon raiders as operating with detailed knowledge of tidal patterns, coastal geography, and the locations of valuable settlements, suggesting extensive reconnaissance and intelligence gathering operations. These attacks typically focused on wealthy villa estates, commercial centers, and religious sites that offered both immediate plunder and strategic value. The raiders demonstrated remarkable tactical sophistication, often coordinating simultaneous attacks at multiple points along the coast to prevent Roman forces from concentrating their response efforts. The Roman military response to Saxon maritime threats led to the establishment of an extensive coastal defense system known as the Saxon Shore, stretching from the Wash to the Isle of Wight and extending across the Channel to include fortifications in northern Gaul. These fortifications represented a new approach to coastal defense, featuring massive walls up to 20 feet thick and incorporating architectural innovations specifically designed to counter seaborne attacks. Forts like Richborough, Dover, and Pevensey featured protected harbors where Roman naval vessels could shelter while maintaining rapid response capabilities. While their elevated disposition provided commanding views of approaching threats across miles of open water, the Saxon shore forts themselves reveal the scale of the threat posed by Saxon raiders and the resources Rome was willing to commit to containing them. Port Chester Castle, one of the best preserved examples, enclosed nearly 9 acres within walls that rose 20 feet above ground level and extended deep into the earth to prevent undermining. The fort's design incorporated multiple defensive layers, including external ditches, gate complexes with multiple barriers, and internal structures positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Garrison forces typically numbered several hundred soldiers, including both regular legionary troops and specialized naval personnel trained in amphibious warfare techniques. The recruitment of Saxon foederati by Roman authorities represented a pragmatic recognition that military solutions alone could not address the Saxon threat. These formal agreements brought Saxon warbands into Roman service as allied troops, providing them with regular pay, equipment, and legal status within the empire in exchange for military service against other barbarian groups. The foederati system offered advantages to both sides. Romans gained experienced warriors familiar with Germanic tactics and terrain, while Saxons obtained legitimate access to Roman territories and resources. Archaeological evidence from military sites in Britain and Gaul reveals the presence of Germanic military equipment and burial practices alongside Roman material culture, indicating the integration of Saxon warriors into imperial defensive arrangements. The internal pressures driving Saxon migration included demographic changes that placed increasing strain on the carrying capacity of their traditional territories. Pollen analysis from bog sites across the Saxon homeland reveals intensified agricultural activity during the 2nd and 3rd centuries, with extensive forest clearance and expansion of cultivated areas, suggesting population growth that pushed the limits of available arable land. Settlement archaeology confirms this pattern with new villages established in previously marginal areas and existing communities expanding beyond their original boundaries. The exhaustion of easily cultivated soils and competition for prime agricultural land created tensions within and between tribal groups that migration offered to resolve. Climate change during the 3rd and 4th centuries exacerbated these demographic pressures by reducing agricultural productivity across northern Europe. Paleoclimatic data indicates a cooling trend that shortened growing seasons and increased the frequency of crop failures, while rising sea levels threatened coastal settlements and reduced the availability of productive lowland areas. The Saxon homeland, with its extensive wetlands and marginal soils, prove particularly vulnerable to these environmental changes. Archaeological evidence from abandoned settlements reveals layers of wind-blown sand and peat accumulation that suggest agricultural abandonment in the face of deteriorating conditions. The pressure from Hunnic and other eastern tribal movements created a cascade effect that ultimately reached Saxon territories through a complex chain of displacement and migration. The Hunnic expansion westward during the 4th century displaced Gothic and other Germanic groups from the Black Sea region, forcing them to seek new territories further west. This displacement created pressure on intermediate tribal groups, who in turn pressed against their western neighbors in a domino effect that eventually reached the North Sea coast. Saxon groups found themselves competing not only with traditional rivals, but also with newly arrived refugees and displaced populations seeking settlement opportunities. The Hunnic impact on Saxon society extended beyond simple territorial pressure to include changes in military technology and tactics. Contact with Eastern nomadic groups introduced new weapons technologies, particularly improved composite bows and cavalry techniques that influenced Saxon military development. Archaeological finds from 4th century Saxon sites include horse equipment and weapon styles that show clear Eastern influences, suggesting active adoption of new military technologies. The emphasis on mobility and rapid deployment that characterized Hunnic warfare found ready acceptance among Saxon war bands already adapted to amphibious operations. The development of Saxon maritime capabilities represented a crucial adaptation to their coastal environment and growing involvement in North Sea trade networks. Early vessels were likely simple rowing boats suitable for river and coastal navigation, but archaeological evidence suggests increasingly sophisticated shipbuilding techniques during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The discovery of boat graves and ship-shaped monuments indicates the central role of seafaring and Saxon identity, while the presence of foreign goods and coastal settlements demonstrates the effectiveness of their maritime trade networks. These nautical skills would prove essential as Saxon groups began venturing beyond their traditional territories in search of new opportunities. Roman sources provide fragmentary but valuable information about early Saxon-Roman interactions along the northern frontier. The first definitive mention of Saxons appears in the geography of Ptolemy around 150 AD, placing them in the Holstein region and confirming their position as neighbors to other well-domined Germanic tribes. Roman military reports from the 3rd century describe increasing Saxon involvement in piratical activities along the North Sea coast, suggesting their maritime capabilities had developed to the point where they could threaten Roman shipping and coastal settlements. These early conflicts established patterns of interaction that would characterize Saxon-Roman relations for centuries, combining periods of trade and cooperation with episodes of raiding and warfare. The Roman response to Saxon maritime activities included the establishment of coastal fortifications and naval patrols designed to protect provincial territories from seaborne attacks. Archaeological evidence from Roman coastal forts in Britain and Gaul reveals modifications specifically designed to counter Saxon raiding tactics, including improved harbor defenses and early warning systems. These defensive measures inadvertently provided Saxon raiders with valuable intelligence about Roman military capabilities and coastal geography, knowledge that would prove instrumental in their later successful invasions of Roman territories. Saxon settlement patterns during the Roman Iron Age demonstrate remarkable continuity with earlier prehistoric traditions while incorporating new influences from contact with the Roman world. Villages typically occupied elevated positions near rivers or coastal areas, taking advantage of natural defensive features while maintaining access to transportation routes and marine resources. The layout of these settlements reveals careful planning with residential areas separated from craft production zones and communal buildings positioned to serve the entire community. Storage facilities for grain and other commodities indicate successful agricultural adaptation to the challenging northern climate, while the presence of specialized workshops demonstrates increasing economic diversification. The religious landscape of early Saxon society blended traditional Germanic beliefs with evolving practices that reflected their unique environmental and cultural circumstances. Sacred groves, springs, and other natural features served as focal points for community worship. While archaeological evidence suggests the practice of ritual deposition in wetlands and rivers, the discovery of votive offerings, including weapons, jewelry, and precious metals and bog sites across the Saxon homeland, indicates sophisticated religious practices that may have served to reinforce social bonds and demonstrate community prosperity. These religious traditions would later influence Saxon responses to Christianity and shape the syncret beliefs that characterized their conversion period. The linguistic evidence for early Saxon identity reveals connections to the broader West Germanic language family, while maintaining distinct dialectical features that would later influence the development of Old English. Place name studies across the Saxon homeland demonstrate consistent naming patterns that reflect their environmental adaptation and social organization, with numerous references to clearings, rivers, and defensive positions. The preservation of Saxon legal terminology in later written sources suggests sophisticated concepts of property rights, social obligation, and collective responsibility that originated during this formative period. The transformation of Saxon society from settled agricultural communities to mobile warrior groups capable of challenging Roman authority across the North Sea began during the turbulent 3rd century, when mounting pressures both within their homeland and along the broader Germanic frontier forced fundamental changes in their way of life. The relative stability that had characterized Saxon territories during the Roman Iron Age gave way to an era of unprecedented mobility, as tribal groups found themselves caught between expanding populations, deteriorating climatic conditions, and the ripple effects of massive population movements originating far to the east. These converging forces would reshape not only Saxon society, but the entire political landscape of northwestern Europe as traditional boundaries dissolved and new patterns of conflict and settlement emerged. The breakdown of Roman frontier defenses along the Rhine represented a critical turning point that opened new possibilities for Saxon expansion beyond their traditional territories. The 3rd century crisis of the Roman Empire had severely weakened the military infrastructure that had previously contained Germanic tribal movements, with legions withdrawn for frontier positions to deal with civil wars and threats elsewhere in the empire. The Rhine fortifications, once an impermeable barrier backed by substantial military forces, became increasingly porous as garrison strength dwindled and maintenance declined. Saxon war bands, initially operating as opportunistic raiders, quickly recognized these vulnerabilities and began coordinating larger-scale operations that exploited gaps in Roman defensive coverage. The Saxon participation in the broader Germanic migrations during this period reflected both their growing military capabilities and the increasing pressures within their homeland. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites across Holstein and Westphalia reveals significant population decline during the 3rd and 4th centuries, suggesting large-scale immigration rather than demographic collapse from warfare or disease. Entire communities appear to have abandoned long-established settlements, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and the foundations of buildings that had served multiple generations. This pattern of organized departure rather than gradual drift indicates coordinated decision at the tribal level and suggests that Saxon migrations were planned responses to deteriorating conditions rather than desperate flights from immediate threats. The Saxon peoples emerged from the windswept marshlands and dense forests of the North German plain during the early centuries of the Common Era. Their origins deeply rooted in the complex tribal mosaic that characterized northern Germania beyond the Roman frontier. These Germanic groups coalesced primarily across 3 distinct yet interconnected regions. The boggy lowlands of Holstein, with its numerous river valleys and coastal inlets. The rolling hills and river systems of Westphalia, where the Weser and Ems rivers carved their paths toward the North Sea, and the expansive heathlands of what would later bear their name as Lower Saxony. The geographic foundation of Saxon identity extended northward into the Jutland Peninsula, where archaeological evidence reveals sustained cultural and material connections with Danish tribal groups, creating a broader North Sea Germanic cultural sphere that would prove crucial to Saxon development. The North German plain itself presented both opportunities and challenges that fundamentally shaped Saxon society. The region's numerous rivers, the Elbe or Weser, Ems, and their countless tributaries, provided natural highways for trade and communication, while simultaneously creating isolated pockets of settlement, separated by extensive wetlands and forests. These geographic barriers fostered the development of distinct local identities within the broader Saxon Confederation, each group adapting to specific environmental conditions while maintaining shared cultural and linguistic ties. The coastal regions offered access to marine resources and encouraged the development of seafaring skills that would later prove instrumental in Saxon expansion. While the interior forest provided timber, game, and defensive positions against external threats, archaeological investigations across Holstein have revealed settlement patterns dating to the 1st century AD that demonstrate sophisticated adaptation to the challenging wetland environment. Excavations at sites like Fetis and Vera have uncovered elevated settlements constructed on artificial mounds to protect against seasonal flooding with carefully planned layouts featuring central halls surrounded by smaller residential and craft buildings. These settlements typically house between 200 and 500 inhabitants organized around extended family groups that form the basic social units of Saxon society. The construction techniques employed massive timber frames filled with ley and daub, creating structures capable of withstanding the harsh North Sea climate while accommodating the social needs of these early communities. The tribal confederation structure that characterized Saxon political organization represented a complex balance between local autonomy and collective identity. Unlike the centralized kingdoms that would later emerge, early Saxon society operated through a network of loosely affiliated tribal groups, each maintaining its own territory, leadership, and customs while recognizing shared ancestry and cultural bonds. This confederation model allowed for flexible responses to external threats and opportunities, enabling rapid mobilization of warriors from multiple tribes when circumstances demanded collective action. The system also facilitated the peaceful resolution of disputes through established protocols and the maintenance of trade relationships across tribal boundaries. Central to Saxon social organization was the institution of the comites, warrior bands that formed around charismatic leaders and serve as the backbone of both military and political power. These groups typically consisted of young men who had sworn personal loyalty to a war leader, binding themselves through sacred oaths that created bonds stronger than blood kinship. The Comitartata system provided a mechanism for social advancement, allowing talented warriors to rise in status regardless of birth, while simultaneously creating networks of obligation and reciprocity that extended throughout Saxon society. Archaeological evidence from weapon burials across the region reveals the sophisticated martial culture that supported these warrior bands with high-quality spears, shields, and occasional swords, indicating both the importance placed on military prowess and the existence of skilled metalwork traditions. The democratic elements of Saxon governance manifested through tribal assemblies known as things, gatherings where free men could voice opinions, settle disputes, and participate in decision-making processes that affected the entire community. These assemblies typically convened at sacred groves or other religiously significant locations, emphasizing the connection between political authority and spiritual legitimacy. The Thing system provided a counterbalance to the power of war leaders and aristocratic families, ensuring that major decisions required some degree of popular consent. Archaeological evidence suggests these gatherings were often accompanied by feasting and religious ceremonies, reinforcing social bonds while conducting essential community business. Material culture from the Roman Iron Age reveals the sophistication of Saxon craftsmanship and the extent of their trade networks. Pottery production shows both local traditions and influences from Roman provincial workshops, indicating active commercial relationships despite political tensions. Metalwork reached impressive levels of skill, with Saxon smiths producing not only weapons and tools, but also intricate jewelry and decorative objects that demonstrate mastery of complex techniques, including pattern welding and filigree work. The discovery of Roman coins, glass vessels, and luxury goods in Saxon settlements confirms extensive trade relationships that brought Mediterranean products to the North German plain in exchange for amber, furs, and other northern commodities. Burial customs during this period provide crucial insights into Saxon social structure and religious beliefs. Cremation remained the predominant practice, with ashes typically placed in ceramic urns and buried in extensive cemetery fields that served multiple generations. The grave goods accompanying these burials reveal clear social stratification, with elite individuals interred alongside weapons, jewelry, and imported luxury items, while common burials contain simpler assemblages of everyday objects. The presence of horse burials and ship-shaped stone settings at some sites indicates the importance of mobility and maritime connections in Saxon worldview, foreshadowing their later reputation as seafaring raiders and settlers.